Summer camp at Pinewood had always been my escape from the suffocating routine of suburban life. At 17, I thought I knew what fear was. The anxiety of final exams, the terror of asking someone to prom, the dread of college applications looming ahead. But that was before the summer of 2017, before I met Cassandra, and before the night that would forever change how I understood the fragility of the human mind. Cassandra was unlike any girl I'd encountered in my sheltered high school existence. She carried herself with the swagger of someone who'd seen more of life's darker corners than most kids our age. Her black hair was always pulled back in a severe ponytail, and she wore her camp-issued t-shirts like armor, sleeves rolled up to reveal intricate scars along her forearms, not self-inflicted, she'd later tell me, but remnants of a house fire when she was 12. She never backed down from anything or anyone, whether it was climbing the highest tree during our outdoor adventures or staring down the camp bullies who thought they could intimidate the new kids. What I respected most about Cassandra was her brutal honesty. She didn't sugarcoat anything, didn't pretend to be someone she wasn't. When other campers complained about the lumpy mattresses or the questionable cafeteria food, Cassandra would just shrug and say she'd slept in worse places, eaten worse things. There was a hardness to her that intrigued me, a shell that seemed impenetrable. Our cabin, Cedar Lodge, housed 12 campers and 2 counselors. The building itself was ancient by camp standards, constructed in the 1960s with rough-hewn logs and a metal roof that amplified every raindrop into a thunderous drumbeat. The smell of decades of teenage occupancy lingered in the walls, a mixture of bug spray, sunscreen, dirty laundry, and something else I could never quite identify. Perhaps fear itself, accumulated over countless summers of homesick children and whispered ghost stories. My bunk was directly across from Cassandra's, with our mutual friend Diego occupying the bed between us. The proximity meant I had a front row seat to observe her nightly rituals, which I found oddly comforting in their consistency. Every single night, without fail, she would arrange a small LED lantern on the windowsill beside her bed, check the batteries twice, and keep it burning until morning. When Diego jokingly asked her about it the first week, she'd simply said she liked to read late into the night, but I noticed she never had a book in her hands after lights out, just her eyes fixed on that steady glow, as if it were the only thing standing between her and something terrible. The weather that July had been unsettled, with afternoon thunderstorms rolling through the mountains with increasing frequency and intensity. The camp staff tried to maintain their cheerful demeanor, but I caught glimpses of concern in their hushed conversations during mealtimes. The local news had been reporting unusual atmospheric pressure readings, and there were whispers among the older counselors about previous summers when severe weather had forced early evacuations. By the third week, even Cassandra seemed on edge. Her usual bravado was replaced by a hyper-vigilant watchfulness, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. She'd started positioning herself with her back to walls during group activities, and I noticed her flinch whenever someone approached her from behind. Diego and I exchanged concerned glances, but didn't press her for explanations. We'd learned that Cassandra shared information on her own terms, never under pressure. The signs were building toward something catastrophic, though none of us recognized them at the time. The birds had grown silent during the day, no longer providing their usual soundtrack of chirps and calls. Even the insects seemed subdued, their normal evening chorus reduced to an occasional cricket or the distant buzz of a mosquito. The air itself felt heavy, pressing down on the camp like a physical weight that made breathing laborious and thinking difficult. The morning of July 23rd dawned with an oppressive stillness that made everyone uncomfortable. The sky was an odd shade of green-gray that I'd never seen before, and the humidity was so thick it felt like walking through warm cotton. During breakfast, the camp director, Miss Rodriguez, announced that all outdoor activities would be canceled for the day due to severe weather warnings. We were to remain in our cabins or the main lodge until further notice. I spent the morning writing letters home, something I'd been putting off for weeks. As I described the camp's activities and my new friendships, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that I was documenting something that was about to end, not just the camp session, but something more fundamental. The sensation was so strong that I actually dated the letter for the following day, as if I knew that after tonight, time would be measured differently. Cassandra spent the morning obsessively checking and rechecking her small backpack, the one she never let out of her sight. I'd always assumed it contained the usual teenage contraband, cigarettes, candy, maybe some photos from home. But watching her count and recount whatever was inside, her lips moving silently as she cataloged each item, I realized the bag contained something much more significant. Emergency supplies, perhaps, or mementos from whatever trauma had shaped her into the guarded person she'd become. Diego tried to lighten the mood by organizing card games and sharing stories from his childhood in Phoenix, but even his infectious laugh couldn't penetrate the atmosphere of growing dread that seemed to be settling over our cabin like a fog. The younger campers were becoming increasingly restless, their usual chatter replaced by nervous giggles and darting glances toward the windows. Our counselors, Tanya and Mike, both college sophomores who usually radiated confident authority, were checking their phones constantly and speaking in low, urgent tones whenever they thought we weren't listening. By early afternoon, the first radio broadcasts began filtering through the camp's communication system. Tornado watches had been upgraded to warnings for our entire county. The National Weather Service was tracking a supercell thunderstorm that had already spawned multiple tornadoes as it moved eastward through the mountains. Expected arrival time, sunset. The camp's emergency protocols swung into action with military precision. All campers were to return to their cabins immediately after dinner, which would be served early. We were to remain in our bunks with flashlights and battery-powered radios until the all-clear was given. No one was to leave the cabins for any reason without direct authorization from the camp director. The swimming pool, recreational buildings, and outdoor areas were declared off-limits until morning. As we filed into the dining hall for what would be our last normal meal together, I caught sight of Cassandra's face and profile. Her jaw was clenched so tightly that I could see the muscles working beneath her skin, and her eyes had taken on a 1,000-yard stare that reminded me of war veterans in documentaries. She barely touched her food, instead spending the meal slowly rotating her water glass in perfect circles, the ice cubes creating a rhythmic clinking that somehow seemed ominous rather than soothing. The storm's arrival became audible during dessert, a low rumbling that started as barely perceptible vibration and gradually built into a continuous growl of thunder rolling across the mountain peaks. Through the dining hall's large windows, we watched the forest bend and sway, as wind gusts tested the strength of trees that had weathered decades of mountain storms. But this felt different, more violent and personal, as if nature itself had developed a malicious intent. The run from the dining hall to Cedar Lodge remains one of the most terrifying physical experiences of my life. What had been ominous rumbling just minutes earlier had exploded into a full-scale meteorological assault. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked, grabbing at our clothes and hair with what felt like malicious intent, trying to lift us off the ground and hurl us into the darkness. Rain struck like bullets, each drop hitting with enough force to sting exposed skin. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the span of an hour, turning the warm summer evening into something that felt like late autumn. Lightning blazed across the sky in continuous sheets rather than individual bolts, creating a strobing effect that turned the familiar campgrounds into an alien landscape of stark shadows and blinding white illumination. I ran directly behind Cassandra, close enough to grab her if the wind tried to steal her away. Even through the chaos, I could see her technique. She moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who'd fled through dangerous territory before. Her backpack was clutched to her chest rather than worn normally, her head down to protect her face from the driving rain, her steps measured and purposeful despite the urgency of our situation. Diego stumbled twice during the 50-yard sprint, saved both times by the combined efforts of Cassandra and myself. His face was white with terror, his usual easy smile replaced by wide-eyed panic as he struggled to maintain his footing on the rain-slicked path. Behind us, other campers were crying, shouting instructions to each other, and generally adding to the chaos. But ahead of us, Cassandra moved like a ghost, silent and focused, as if she'd been preparing for this exact scenario her entire life. The cabin door slammed shut behind the last of our group with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, the familiar space had been transformed by the emergency lighting and the sounds of the storm battering the building from all sides. The metal roof amplified every raindrop into a percussion symphony that made conversation nearly impossible without shouting. Wind found every gap in the old log construction, creating whistling sounds that seemed almost musical in their variety and intensity. Tanya and Mike immediately began distributing flashlights and checking their radio for emergency broadcasts. The news was not reassuring. Multiple tornadoes had been confirmed on the ground, with at least 2 tracking directly toward our area. All residents of the county were advised to seek immediate shelter in interior rooms, away from windows, and to remain there until morning. The expected duration of the severe weather, 6 to 8 hours. As we settled into our bunks with our emergency supplies, I noticed Cassandra had positioned herself in the corner bed farthest from any windows, her back against the solid log wall. Her LED lantern was already burning, casting a small circle of warm light that seemed pathetically inadequate against the supernatural darkness pressing against the cabin's windows. She'd arranged her possessions with military precision, flashlight within easy reach, backpack contents apparently inventoried and ready for rapid deployment, shoes positioned for immediate use. The storm continued to intensify throughout the early evening hours. Tree branches began striking the roof and walls with increasing frequency, each impact sending vibrations through the entire structure. The electrical power failed around 9 o'clock, plunging us into a world illuminated only by scattered flashlight beams and Cassandra's unwavering lantern. The darkness outside the windows was absolute, a black so complete it seemed solid, pressing against the glass like something alive trying to force its way inside. The power failure changed everything. What had been merely frightening became genuinely terrifying as our modern securities were stripped away one by one. The electric lights that had provided psychological comfort vanished. The heater that had been fighting the unseasonable cold fell silent. Even the small sounds of electrical systems, the hum of refrigerators, the whisper of air circulation, disappeared, leaving only the storm's relentless assault on our fragile shelter. Diego had managed to fall asleep around 10 o'clock. His natural optimism apparently extending to his ability to find rest even in crisis. His steady breathing provided a counterpoint to the chaos outside, a reminder that normal human existence was still possible even as the world seemed intent on destroying itself. I envied his peace, but sleep felt impossible with the storm raging, and Cassandra sitting rigid in her bunk, staring at shadows that seemed to move independently of our flashlight beams. Tanya and Mike had positioned themselves near the radio, taking turns monitoring emergency broadcasts and trying to maintain some semblance of authority in a situation that had clearly exceeded their training. Their voices carried undertones of barely controlled panic as they relayed updates. More tornadoes confirmed, power outages across 3 counties, emergency crews unable to respond until the storm passed. We were truly on our own until dawn. Around midnight, the storm reached what I hoped was its peak intensity. The sound of wind through the trees had evolved from a roar into something more primal, a keening wail that seemed to contain voices, as if the storm itself were screaming in agony or rage. Tree falls became frequent enough that we stopped flinching at each crash, the sounds blending into a continuous soundtrack of destruction. Through brief gaps in the storm's fury, we could hear similar sounds from the direction of other cabins, shouts, crying, the occasional crash of breaking glass or splintering wood. Cassandra had not moved from her position in over an hour. She sat cross-legged on her bunk, back straight against the wall, eyes fixed on the darkest corner of the cabin where the shadows seemed deepest. Her lantern created a small pool of sanity around her, but beyond its reach the darkness writhed and shifted with each lightning flash, creating the illusion of movement where there should be none. I found myself watching the same corner, trying to understand what held her attention so completely. The temperature inside the cabin continued to drop as cold air found every gap in our shelter's defenses. Our breath began to form small clouds in the flashlight beams, and several of the younger campers had wrapped themselves in every blanket they could find. The cold was more than physical discomfort. It carried a psychological weight that made thinking difficult and hope seem like a naive luxury we could no longer afford. As the storm raged on, I became aware of a change in its character. The random violence of wind and rain was gradually being replaced by something that felt more organized, more purposeful. The sounds began to take on patterns, not quite rhythmic, but structured in a way that suggested intelligence behind the chaos. Lightning strikes started to feel coordinated rather than random, illuminating specific areas of our surroundings, as if something were deliberately searching for weaknesses in our defenses. It was during one of these lightning flashes that I first saw what Cassandra had been watching. In the corner where the shadows gathered most thickly, the darkness seemed to have gained substance. Instead of simply being the absence of light, it appeared to have weight and texture, pressing against the walls and ceiling like smoke trapped in an invisible container. The sight lasted only for the duration of the lightning flash, but it was enough to make me understand why Cassandra had been staring with such intensity. The realization that we were being observed came gradually, like a poisonous thought seeping through the barriers of rational denial. What had seemed like tricks of light and shadow began to reveal themselves as something far more sinister, shapes that moved with purpose rather than randomness, darkness that seemed to watch and evaluate rather than simply exist. Cassandra spoke for the first time in hours, her voice barely audible above the storm but carrying clearly in the unnatural stillness that had settled over our immediate area. "Do you see them too?" she asked, not turning her head from her vigil over the corner. Her question wasn't directed at anyone specific, but I knew she meant me. She'd noticed my growing awareness of whatever presence had taken residence in our cabin. I wanted to deny it, to rationalize away what my eyes were reporting. But the darkness in that corner was moving with too much intention to be dismissed as imagination. It flowed and shifted like liquid, but maintained a coherence that suggested structure beneath its fluid surface. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of what might have been limbs or a head, but the shapes dissolved the moment I tried to focus on them directly. "See what?" Diego mumbled from his bunk, finally awakening as the storm's intensity began to fluctuate rather than maintaining its previous steady assault. His question carried genuine confusion. Apparently, whatever was manifesting in our cabin was selective about its visibility. Tanya and Mike continued their radio monitoring without any sign of awareness, their flashlight beams passing through the corner without revealing anything unusual to their eyes. Cassandra finally turned to look at me, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach clench with fear. It wasn't terror. She was too controlled for that. Instead, her face carried the resigned acceptance of someone confronting a familiar enemy. "They follow me," she said simply. "They always have since the fire. I thought maybe here, with all these people around, they'd leave me alone. But storms make them stronger." The fire she mentioned, the one that had left scars on her arms, suddenly took on new significance. I'd assumed it was a tragic accident, the kind of random disaster that occasionally destroys families and leaves survivors struggling to rebuild. But the way she spoke about them suggested something more complex, more personal. These weren't random supernatural entities drawn by tragedy. They were specifically connected to Cassandra, following her like predators that had selected their prey and were waiting for the right moment to strike. As if responding to her acknowledgement, the darkness in the corner began to move more aggressively. What had been subtle shifting became obvious manipulation of space and shadow. The temperature around us dropped another 10 degrees, and our breath began to form not just visible clouds but actual crystals that tinkled to the floor like broken glass. The sound of the storm outside seemed to recede, replaced by something that might have been breathing, slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that came from everywhere and nowhere. Diego sat up on his bunk, finally fully awake and alert.
"Guys, what's happening? It's getting really cold, and I swear I can hear—"
He trailed off as his flashlight beam swept across the corner. And for a moment, just long enough for all three of us to see clearly, the darkness took on a definite shape, not human, but not entirely alien either. It was tall enough that it had to hunch to fit beneath the cabin's sloped ceiling, and its proportions were wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Where eyes should have been, there were points of dim red light that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the illumination from our flashlights. The sight lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the thing retreated deeper into shadow, but it was enough to shatter Diego's composure completely. He began to hyperventilate, his flashlight shaking so violently that its beam created a strobe effect across the cabin walls. "What was that?" he gasped. "What the hell was that thing?" Cassandra moved with practiced efficiency, pulling a small bottle from her backpack and forcing Diego to drink whatever it contained. His panic attack subsided within minutes, replaced by a glassy-eyed calm that suggested she'd given him something stronger than water. "Sedative," she explained when I shot her a questioning look. "My doctor prescribed it for emergencies. He's better off unconscious right now. With Diego safely medicated and our counselors still obliviously monitoring their radio, Cassandra and I were left alone to confront whatever had taken residence in our cabin. The thing in the corner seemed to sense the reduction in witnesses and began to manifest more boldly. The red points of light that served as its eyes grew brighter, and I could make out more details of its impossible anatomy. Limbs that bent in too many places, fingers that extended far beyond normal proportions, a face that seemed to shift between human and something else entirely. It feeds on fear, Cassandra explained in the matter-of-fact tone she used for discussing camp activities or meal schedules. The more terrified you are, the more solid it becomes. That's why I keep the light burning. Not because I'm afraid of the dark, but because I need to see them coming. You can't fight something you can't see. The knowledge that our fear was literally fueling the entity's manifestation created a vicious cycle. Trying not to be afraid of something actively threatening you is like trying not to think of a white elephant. The very effort creates the opposite result. I could feel my terror feeding the thing, watching it grow more substantial with each racing heartbeat, each drop of cold sweat that trickled down my spine. The storm outside had evolved into something beyond meteorological explanation. The wind now carried voices, not quite human, but close enough to be disturbing. They seemed to be calling names, though not names I recognized. The voices carried emotions too complex for simple sound: longing, hunger, and something that might have been loneliness so profound it had curdled into malevolence. As the thing in the corner continued to solidify, other phenomena began manifesting throughout the cabin. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The temperature variations became extreme, patches of freezing cold alternating with areas that felt like they were heated by invisible fires. Our flashlight beams began to bend and distort, creating impossible angles that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing of all were the changes in our counselors. While they remained unaware of the primary manifestation, they were clearly being affected by whatever presence had invaded our space. Their radio conversations became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to people and places that made no sense. Tanya began speaking to empty air, carrying on detailed conversations with invisible companions. Mike started laughing at random intervals, not the normal laughter of someone trying to maintain morale, but the hollow sound of someone whose grip on reality was slipping. They're being influenced too, Cassandra observed. It's not just about seeing the entities directly. They create fields of disturbance that affect everyone nearby. That's what happened to my family during the fire. Not everyone could see what I saw, but everyone felt the effects. The mention of her family raised questions I didn't dare ask. How many people had been affected? How many had survived? And why had Cassandra been spared when others presumably hadn't been so fortunate? But there was no time for personal history. The thing in the corner was becoming more active, testing the boundaries of our small circle of lantern light, like a predator probing for weaknesses in its prey's defenses. Around 3 a.m, the entity made its first direct attempt to communicate. The voices from the storm outside suddenly unified into a single, clear sound that bypassed our ears entirely and spoke directly to our minds. It didn't use words. Language was too crude a tool for the concepts it wanted to convey. Instead, it transmitted pure meaning, flooding our consciousness with images and sensations that no human vocabulary could adequately describe. The message was simple in its horror. We were not the first group it had encountered, and we would not be the last. It had been feeding on human fear for longer than our civilization had existed, following catastrophes and disasters like a scavenger drawn to carrion. The storm was not a natural phenomenon, but a hunting ground it had created, a controlled environment where it could corner its prey and feast without interruption. The entity's revelation that it had been orchestrating events rather than simply taking advantage of them transformed our situation from bad to hopeless. We weren't just victims of circumstance caught in a natural disaster. We were prey that had been deliberately herded into a trap. Every aspect of our current predicament, from the storm's unusual intensity to our isolation in the cabin, had been engineered to create optimal feeding conditions. Cassandra seemed less surprised by this information than I was, suggesting she'd encountered similar situations before. The fire at my house wasn't an electrical accident, she said quietly, finally sharing the story she'd kept hidden since our friendship began. It started the same way, A storm that came out of nowhere, power failures, and then they appeared. My parents and younger brother couldn't see them directly, but they felt the effects. Dad started drinking heavily, Mom became paranoid and wouldn't let us leave the house, and my brother developed night terrors so severe he had to be hospitalized. She paused to check on Diego, who was still unconscious but breathing steadily. The sedative had been a mercy. Whatever psychological torment he would have endured while conscious was beyond what any 17-year-old should have to experience. The fire started in my room, she continued. I was watching them move around, trying to figure out what they wanted. When one of them reached out and touched the curtains, they just ignited. Not like normal fire, this burned cold and spread faster than anything natural could. The implications of her story were staggering. These entities weren't just passive observers or even simple predators. They were actively malevolent, capable of manipulating physical reality to cause maximum psychological and physical damage to their victims. The fact that Cassandra had survived such an encounter made her either incredibly lucky or incredibly strong. Given what I'd observed of her character, I suspected it was the latter. Our current situation was deteriorating rapidly. The thing in the corner had grown substantial enough to cast its own shadow, creating a recursive loop of darkness within darkness that hurt to contemplate. Its breathing sounds had become unmistakably organic, no longer the ambiguous whispers they'd started as, but clearly biological processes occurring in something that definitely possessed lungs and a respiratory system. The voices in the storm were multiplying as well, suggesting that other entities were being drawn to our location like moths to a flame. What had started as a single presence was becoming a congregation, with each new arrival adding to the oppressive atmosphere that was making thought increasingly difficult. The air itself seemed thick with malevolent intelligence, pressing down on us like a physical weight that threatened to crush whatever sanity we had left. Our counselors had deteriorated to the point where they were no longer reliable sources of help or information. Tanya was now completely engaged in conversations with invisible companions, her side of the dialogue suggesting she was being given detailed instructions about activities that made no logical sense. Mike had stopped monitoring the radio entirely and was instead drawing elaborate diagrams on scraps of paper, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. "We need to last until sunrise," Cassandra said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "They're creatures of storm and darkness. When the sun comes up and the weather clears, they'll retreat to wherever they came from. But we have to survive the next 3 hours without letting them feed enough to become fully materialized." 3 hours. It sounded like nothing under normal circumstances. The length of a movie, a single class period, a short nap. But with terror distorting our perception of time and every minute feeling like an hour, it might as well have been an eternity. The entity in the corner seemed to sense our desperation and began moving more aggressively, testing the boundaries of Cassandra's lantern light, like a wolf probing for gaps in a campfire's protection. The physical manifestations were becoming impossible to ignore. Scratching sounds came from inside the walls, as if something were trying to claw its way through the logs from the outside. The floor began to vibrate in rhythmic patterns that felt like a massive heartbeat coming from beneath the cabin. Most disturbing of all, the shadows cast by our own bodies started to move independently, reaching toward the corner where the primary entity waited with a patience that felt infinite. The final hour before sunrise tested every limit of human endurance. The entities had multiplied to the point where the entire cabin felt saturated with hostile presence. Every corner held watchers, every shadow concealed movement, and the air itself seemed alive with malevolent intelligence. The temperature had dropped to the point where our breath formed not just clouds but actual ice crystals, creating a constant tinkling sound as frozen exhalations fell to the floor. Cassandra's lantern, which had been our sole reliable source of protection, began to flicker as its battery approached exhaustion. Each dimming of the light brought the surrounding darkness closer, and I could see panic beginning to crack her controlled facade for the first time since I'd known her. "I don't have spare batteries," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the sounds of supernatural activity that now filled every corner of our shelter. The scratching in the walls had evolved into what sounded like construction activity, as if multiple entities were working to dismantle our cabin from the inside out. Boards creaked and groaned under pressures that had nothing to do with wind or weather. Through gaps that hadn't existed before, cold air flowed in streams that felt directed and purposeful rather than random. We were being systematically exposed, our defenses stripped away piece by piece. Diego remained unconscious, which continued to be a blessing rather than a curse. His face had taken on an expression of peaceful oblivion that I envied deeply. Whatever dreams the sedative had given him were surely preferable to our waking nightmare. Tanya and Mike had progressed beyond mere psychological influence to what appeared to be complete possession or control. Their movements had become synchronized in ways that normal humans don't move, and when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers rather than individuals. The primary entity in the corner had grown large enough to require the entire vertical space of the cabin, its impossible proportions folded and twisted to accommodate the structural limitations of our shelter. The red lights that served as its eyes had multiplied, creating a constellation of malevolent attention that tracked our every movement. When it shifted position, the sound was like breaking bones amplified through a cathedral's acoustics. As Cassandra's lantern continued to dim, I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of trying to conserve the remaining battery power by reducing the light output, I cranked it to maximum brightness, creating one final burst of illumination that drove the shadows back to their farthest possible positions. The entities recoiled like vampires confronted with garlic, their forms becoming less substantial as the light blazed through our small space. "When it dies," I told Cassandra, "we run for the main lodge. Whatever happens, don't stop moving until we're in a room with other people and electric lights." She nodded grimly, understanding that our window of opportunity would last only as long as it took the entities to realize their prey was attempting to escape. The lantern's death was not gradual. One moment it blazed with final desperation, and the next it flickered out completely, plunging us into a darkness so complete it felt solid. But instead of the expected assault from surrounding entities, we were greeted by something else entirely, the first gray traces of dawn filtering through the cabin's windows. The storm, which had raged with supernatural intensity throughout the night, was beginning to break apart as natural weather patterns reasserted themselves. The effect on our supernatural tormentors was immediate and dramatic. The scratching in the walls stopped abruptly. The temperature began to rise toward normal levels. Most importantly, the oppressive sense of hostile presence that had filled the cabin began to dissipate like morning fog touched by sunlight. The entities weren't destroyed. I could sense them retreating rather than dying, but they were clearly weakened by the approaching day. Cassandra and I didn't wait to see what happened next. We grabbed our essential belongings, checked that Diego was still breathing, and made our escape into the growing daylight. The storm had left the campgrounds transformed, trees down everywhere, buildings damaged, the familiar landscape rearranged by wind and rain. But it all looked wonderfully, gloriously normal in the pale morning light. We found other survivors gathered in the main lodge, sharing stories of a night that had tested everyone's sanity. But as we compared experiences, it became clear that Cassandra and I had encountered something beyond what the others had faced. Their stories were of fear and discomfort, property damage and power outages. Only we spoke of entities and impossible manifestations, of darkness given substance and malevolence made manifest. Later investigation would reveal that our cabin had been built on the site of a previous structure that had burned in 1987, claiming the lives of 3 campers during a similar summer storm. The official reports cited electrical failure and blocked exits, but local folklore spoke of supernatural influences and unexplained phenomena. The rebuilt cabin had been constructed with modern safety features and blessed by local clergy, but apparently some presences are too persistent to be deterred by human precautions. Cassandra never returned to camp after that summer, and she transferred to a different school district before our senior year began. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd continued to experience supernatural encounters, though she'd learned to manage them better as she matured. Diego recovered from his sedative-induced unconsciousness with no memory of the night's supernatural events, though he developed a lasting phobia of storms that persisted into adulthood. As for me, I've never experienced anything similar since that night at Pinewood Camp. Whether the entities were specifically drawn to Cassandra's presence, or whether I was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, I may never know. But I learned something valuable about the nature of fear and courage. Sometimes survival requires not the absence of terror, but the ability to function despite it. In the darkest hours before dawn, when the impossible becomes inevitable and reality becomes negotiable, the only reliable defense is the light we carry within ourselves and our determination to see another sunrise. The camp closed permanently the following winter, citing structural damage from the storm and declining enrollment. The official records make no mention of supernatural activity, but those of us who were there that night carry memories that no amount of official denial can erase. Some experiences transcend explanation, existing in the spaces between what we think we know about reality and what reality actually contains. In those spaces, on nights when storms rage and darkness feels alive with hostile intent, we learn that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep moving forward despite terror, to protect the light that separates civilization from chaos, and to believe that dawn will always come, no matter how long or dark the night may be. "3 years ago, when I was 22, I made what would become the most haunting decision of my life. My close friend Maya had convinced me to join her as a counselor at Cedar Point Summer Camp, located on a remote island 12 miles off the Maine coast. The pay was decent, and the idea of spending July surrounded by pine trees and ocean air seemed like the perfect escape from my suffocating office job. The ferry ride to the island took nearly 2 hours, cutting through choppy gray waters that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. As we approached the dock, I noticed how the thick fog clung to the island's shoreline, obscuring much of the landscape beyond the weathered wooden pier. The other counselors chatted excitedly, but something about the place made my stomach twist with an inexplicable dread. Maya squeezed my shoulder as we disembarked, her blonde hair whipping in the salty wind. "This is going to be amazing," she whispered. But I caught the slight tremor in her voice. Even she seemed affected by the island's oppressive atmosphere. The camp director, a stern woman named Ms. Rodriguez, gathered us in the main lodge, a drafty building that creaked ominously with every gust of wind. The walls were lined with faded photographs of previous camp sessions, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes that seemed to follow our movements. As she assigned cabin placements, I felt my heart sink when she announced that Maya and I would be staying in cabin 14, the furthest accommodation from the main camp. "It's about a quarter-mile hike through the woods," Ms. Rodriguez explained, her weathered face betraying no emotion. "The isolation will help you focus on your duties without distractions." She handed us a hand-drawn map, the paper yellowed with age and marked with warnings about staying on the designated path after dark. Our trek to the cabin was unsettling from the start. The gravel path crunched beneath our feet, each step echoing unnaturally in the dense forest surrounding us. Towering pines blocked out most of the afternoon sunlight, casting everything in perpetual twilight. The air grew noticeably colder as we walked deeper into the woods, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, convinced that something was watching us from between the trees. The cabin itself was a small, rustic structure with peeling paint and windows that looked like hollow eyes in the gathering dusk. Inside, the floorboards groaned under our weight, and the air smelled of mildew and something else, something organic and rotting that I couldn't identify. Maya tried to lighten the mood by unpacking her cheerful decorations, but they looked grotesquely out of place in the cabin's gloomy interior. As night fell, the sounds began. What started as normal forest noises, rustling leaves, distant owl calls, gradually became something more disturbing. There were snapping branches that seemed too deliberate to be caused by small animals, and a rhythmic tapping against the cabin's exterior that had no natural explanation. When I mentioned it to Maya, she laughed nervously and suggested it was just the wind, but I saw her eyes dart toward the windows with the same fear that was building in my chest. Unable to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with our surroundings, I found myself drawn to the large window facing north. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a substantial hill that rose above the forest canopy. During our arrival briefing, Ms. Rodriguez had mentioned it in passing, warning us that it was off-limits to both counselors and campers due to unstable terrain, but something about her delivery had seemed rehearsed, as if she were hiding the real reason. "Maya," I called softly, not wanting to fully voice my growing unease. "Do you want to take a walk? I can't seem to settle in, and the fresh air might help." She looked up from her unpacking, her face pale in the cabin's dim lighting. "Where would we go? It's already past 10, and they specifically told us to stay near the cabin after dark." The reasonable part of my mind knew she was right, but a stronger compulsion was pulling me toward that distant hill. It was as if something was calling to me from up there, though I couldn't explain what or why. "Just a quick hike. We'll stay on the path and be back within an hour. I promise." Maya's hesitation was evident, but she'd always been unable to resist my more adventurous impulses. After a few more minutes of my persuasion, she reluctantly agreed, and we quietly gathered our flashlights and jackets. The cabin door's hinges screamed in protest as we opened it, the sound cutting through the night air like a warning we chose to ignore. The path toward the hill branched off from the main trail about 50 yards from our cabin. This secondary route was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and low-hanging branches that caught at our clothing like grasping fingers. Our flashlight beams seemed pathetically weak against the absolute darkness surrounding us, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on our peripheral vision. As we walked, the forest around us became increasingly silent. The normal sounds of nocturnal wildlife gradually faded until we were walking through an unnatural quiet that made every footstep sound like a gunshot. The air grew thick and humid, carrying strange scents that reminded me of ozone before a thunderstorm mixed with something metallic and bitter. "Maybe we should turn back," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible even in the silence. "This doesn't feel right." But I was already committed to reaching that hill, driven by a compulsion I couldn't understand or resist. "We're almost there," I replied, though truthfully I had no idea how much farther we had to go. The darkness ahead seemed to stretch infinitely, swallowing our flashlight beams as if they were being absorbed by something hungry and waiting. The hill's summit was larger than it had appeared from the cabin, a circular clearing perhaps 50 feet across with an unobstructed view of the night sky. As we crested the final ridge, both Maya and I stopped abruptly, overwhelmed by the sensation that we had entered a space that was somehow different from the rest of the world. The silence here was absolute. No insects, no wind through the trees, not even the distant sound of waves against the island's shores. It was as if we had stepped into a vacuum where normal laws of nature no longer applied. The grass beneath our feet felt wrong, too soft and yielding, almost spongy, and when I aimed my flashlight downward, I noticed it had an odd bluish tint that seemed to shimmer in the artificial light. Maya grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket with desperate strength. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her breath forming visible clouds despite the warm summer night. I knew exactly what she meant. There was a pressure in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on us from above, while simultaneously pulling at something deep in our chests. My ears began to ring with a high-pitched tone that grew steadily louder, and I felt a strange tingling sensation crawling across my skin like thousands of invisible insects. That's when we saw it. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a distant star, a faint point of light hovering motionless above the horizon. But as we watched, transfixed by a terror we couldn't name, it began to grow larger and brighter. What had seemed like a single light resolved into 3 distinct red points arranged in a perfect triangle, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed to match the sudden racing of my heartbeat. The object moved with impossible smoothness, gliding through the air without any visible means of propulsion or any sound that would indicate conventional aircraft. As it drew closer, I could make out its shape more clearly, a dark, metallic mass that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness, making it difficult to determine its exact size or configuration. Maya's breathing became rapid and shallow beside me, and I realized that my own lungs felt constricted, as if the air around us had become too thin to properly sustain life. The ringing in my ears intensified until it became a piercing whine that made thinking clearly almost impossible. The craft, for lack of a better word, continued its approach until it was perhaps 200 feet above us. close enough that I could see details on its surface. The metal appeared to ripple like liquid, shifting and changing in ways that hurt to look at directly. Strange protrusions extended and retracted from its hull in seemingly random patterns, and occasionally, brief flashes of light would travel across its surface like electrical discharges. Then, without warning, all three red lights suddenly intensified, bathing the entire hilltop in a crimson glow that made everything look like a scene from hell. The light penetrated through my closed eyelids, and even when I tried to shield my face with my hands, it seemed to burn directly into my brain. Maya screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut through even the deafening whine filling the air. The sound of her terror broke whatever spell had held me frozen, and suddenly we were both running, crashing through the underbrush toward the path back to our cabin. We ran without stopping until we reached the cabin, our lungs burning and our hearts hammering against our ribs. Maya's hands shook so violently that she couldn't work the door handle, and I had to push her aside to get us inside. Once the door was closed and locked behind us, we both collapsed onto the nearest bed, gasping for air and trying to process what we had just experienced. The next several hours passed in a haze of fear and confusion. Maya sat huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly back and forth. Occasionally she would start to say something about what we had seen, but the words would die in her throat, as if her mind was refusing to acknowledge the reality of our encounter. I tried to rationalize what had happened, running through every possible explanation I could think of. Military aircraft, weather balloons, some kind of experimental technology. But none of these possibilities could account for the craft's impossible movements or the strange effects it had produced in the environment around us. As dawn approached, I noticed that neither of us had been able to achieve anything resembling real rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those three red lights burning behind my eyelids, and the memory of that metallic whining sound would return with such clarity that I would jolt awake, convinced that the craft had returned. Maya finally spoke as the first pale light of sunrise began filtering through the cabin's grimy windows. "We can't tell anyone about this," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. "They'll think we're insane." But even as we made this pact of silence, I knew that keeping quiet would be impossible. The experience had changed something fundamental about how I perceived the world around us. Every shadow seemed deeper, every unexpected sound carried sinister implications, and the very air itself felt charged with invisible threats. During the following day's activities with the campers, I found it nearly impossible to concentrate on my responsibilities. The children's laughter sounded hollow and distant, and I caught myself constantly scanning the sky, searching for any sign of the craft's return. Maya exhibited similar behavior, jumping at sudden noises and showing an uncharacteristic irritability with the kids under our care. The other counselors began to notice our strange behavior by the afternoon. During lunch, one of them commented on how tired we both looked, and another asked if we were feeling ill. Each innocent question felt like an accusation, as if they somehow knew about our nocturnal adventure and were testing us to see if we would confess. That evening, as we returned to our isolated cabin, the forest seemed even more threatening than before. Shadows appeared to move independently of their sources, and the normal sounds of wildlife were replaced by an oppressive silence that made every step sound unnaturally loud. The path back to our cabin felt longer than usual, as if the distance was somehow stretching with each footfall. Inside the cabin, we tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken terror. Maya prepared a simple dinner, but neither of us could manage more than a few bites. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, and every swallow was an effort that left me feeling nauseous. As darkness fell, the sounds began again, the same deliberate snapping of branches and rhythmic tapping against the cabin's exterior that we had heard the night before. But now these sounds carried a different weight, a sense of deliberate intelligence that made them far more terrifying than random forest noises. Despite every rational thought screaming against it, I found myself once again drawn to the window facing the hill. The compulsion was stronger than the previous night, an almost physical pull that made it difficult to focus on anything else. Maya noticed my distraction and begged me not to even consider returning to that cursed hilltop, but the urge was becoming impossible to resist. "There's something wrong with me," I confessed to her around midnight, my hands pressed against the window glass as I stared into the darkness. "I can't stop thinking about going back up there. It's like something is calling to me." Maya's face reflected the same internal struggle. Despite her obvious terror, I could see in her eyes that she was experiencing the same irresistible pull. "Maybe if we go back, we'll realize it was just our imagination," she said, though her voice carried no conviction. "Maybe in daylight or with better equipment, we'll see that it was something perfectly normal." But we both knew we weren't going to wait for daylight. The compulsion was too strong, and the not knowing was almost worse than the fear itself. By 1 a.m., we had once again gathered our flashlights and were making our way through the forest toward the hill. This time, the journey felt different. The path seemed to have changed somehow, with new obstacles and turns that I didn't remember from the previous night. Branches caught at our clothing with what felt like deliberate intent, and more than once, I could have sworn I heard footsteps following us through the underbrush. Footsteps that stopped whenever we paused to listen. The forest around us felt alive with malevolent intelligence. Trees appeared to lean inward over the path, creating tunnels of darkness that our flashlights could barely penetrate. The air grew progressively colder as we climbed, and by the time we neared the summit, our breath was forming thick clouds that hung motionless in the still air. Maya stopped suddenly about 20 feet from the clearing's edge, her entire body rigid with terror. "It's already here," she whispered, pointing toward the hilltop with a shaking hand. Even before we reached the summit, I could see the glow. The same crimson light from the night before was painting the trees around the clearing, pulsing with that same hypnotic rhythm. But this time, there was something different about the quality of the light. It seemed more intense, more focused, as if whatever was producing it had grown stronger or more interested in our presence. As we crept to the edge of the clearing, trying to remain hidden among the trees, I felt my legs grow weak with terror. The craft was there, just as we had seen it before, but now it was much closer to the ground, perhaps only 50 feet above the hilltop. Its surface rippled and shifted in the red light, and I could hear a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath our feet. But what made this encounter infinitely more terrifying was the realization that the craft was waiting for us. Its position, its timing, even the quality of its light, everything suggested that our return had been anticipated, perhaps even orchestrated. As we watched from the tree line, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and fascination, the craft began to descend further. The humming sound grew louder, becoming a deep throbbing that I could feel in my bones. The red lights arranged in their triangular pattern began to pulse more rapidly, and new lights appeared along the craft's edges, smaller, white pinpricks that moved in complex patterns across its surface. Maya grabbed my arm so tightly that her fingernails drew blood through my jacket. "We need to leave," she hissed. But even as she spoke, I could see that she was as transfixed as I was. Something about the craft's presence made it impossible to look away, as if it was exerting some kind of magnetic pull on our consciousness. The air around us began to change. The temperature dropped even further, and I noticed that the grass at the clearing's edge was beginning to frost over despite the warm summer night. My skin started to tingle with what felt like static electricity, and the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stood on end. Then the craft settled into a perfect hover just 30 feet above the center of the clearing, close enough that I could make out intricate details on its hull. The surface wasn't uniformly metallic as I had first thought. Instead, it appeared to be covered with thousands of small, hexagonal panels that shifted color and transparency in waves. Occasionally, one of these panels would become completely transparent, offering glimpses of a complex interior filled with pulsing lights and incomprehensible machinery. A new sound joined the humming, a series of high-pitched tones that seemed to form a pattern, almost like a musical phrase repeated over and over. The tones were beautiful in a way that made them even more terrifying, and I found myself unconsciously swaying to their rhythm. Maya's breathing had become so rapid that I was worried she might hyperventilate. "Can you feel that?" she gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "It's like something is pressing down on my lungs." I knew exactly what she meant. The air itself felt heavy and thick, as if we were breathing liquid instead of gas. Each breath required conscious effort, and I could taste something metallic and bitter with every inhalation. Suddenly, without any warning, one of the craft's panels slid open with a sound like tearing silk. A beam of intensely bright white light shot out from the opening, sweeping across the clearing in slow, deliberate arcs. We pressed ourselves against the trees, praying that the shadows would conceal us, but the light seemed to penetrate everything it touched. When the beam passed over us, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. My vision exploded into white-hot pain, and for several seconds, I was completely blind. But worse than the physical discomfort was the sensation that something was examining me, looking through me, cataloging every thought and memory with cold, alien intelligence. The beam moved on, but its effects lingered. My head throbbed with a migraine that felt like ice picks being driven through my skull, and I could taste blood in my mouth where I had bitten my tongue. Maya was in worse condition. She had collapsed to her knees and was vomiting violently into the undergrowth. As we struggled to recover from the beam's effects, the craft began to rise again, slowly ascending until it reached its previous altitude. The musical tones faded, replaced once again by the deep humming that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. But just before the craft disappeared entirely, something fell from its hull, a small, dark object that tumbled through the air before landing with a soft thud in the center of the clearing. Neither Maya nor I was willing to investigate what had fallen from the craft that night. We fled back to our cabin in a state of near panic, stumbling through the forest like wounded animals. The journey that had taken us nearly an hour to complete carefully now passed in a blur of terror-driven adrenaline, and we didn't stop running until we were safely inside with the door locked behind us. The rest of the night passed without any attempt at rest. We sat together on one of the narrow beds, our backs against the wall, watching the windows for any sign of the craft's return. Maya had developed a persistent tremor that shook her entire body, and I found that I couldn't stop my teeth from chattering despite the cabin's stuffy warmth. As dawn broke, I made a decision that I knew Maya would oppose. "I'm going back to the clearing," I announced, reaching for my jacket. "Whatever fell from that thing, I need to see it." "Are you insane?" Maya's voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "What if it's still there? What if they're waiting for us to come back?" But I had passed beyond rational fear into a state of desperate need for proof. The encounters of the past 2 nights had been so far outside normal human experience, that part of my mind was already beginning to doubt their reality. I needed physical evidence, something tangible that would confirm we hadn't shared some kind of collective hallucination. Maya eventually agreed to accompany me, but only after I promised that we would leave immediately if we sensed any danger. The hike to the hilltop in daylight revealed details that had been hidden by darkness: strange burn marks on tree trunks, patches of grass that had been flattened in perfect geometric patterns, and areas where the vegetation had withered and died despite the summer growing season. The clearing itself bore obvious signs of the craft's presence. The grass in the center was compressed into a perfect circle, and the earth beneath showed scorch marks that formed intricate, interlocking patterns. But most significantly, lying exactly where I had seen it fall, was a small metallic object about the size of a golf ball. As I approached it, Maya hung back at the clearing's edge, her face pale with terror. The object appeared to be made of the same rippling, liquid-like metal as the craft's hull, and it pulsed with a faint internal light that seemed to respond to my proximity. When I was within arm's reach, I could hear it emitting a barely audible humming sound, the same tone we had heard from the craft itself. I spent several minutes working up the courage to actually touch it. When I finally did, the sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The metal felt simultaneously hot and cold, solid and liquid, and holding it sent waves of mild electrical shocks up my arm. Most disturbing of all, the object seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, as if it was somehow synchronizing itself with my biological functions. We carefully wrapped the object in one of Maya's t-shirts and carried it back to the cabin, where we spent the morning examining it more closely. Under direct sunlight, new details became visible, tiny symbols or writing etched into its surface that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The internal light grew brighter when exposed to electronic devices, pulsing more rapidly when near our cell phones or flashlights. By afternoon, we had decided that we needed to report our encounters to the authorities, regardless of how insane our story might sound. But when we turned on the small radio in our cabin to check for news, we discovered that we weren't alone in our experiences. The local news was filled with reports of similar sightings across the entire coastal region. Dozens of witnesses had come forward describing encounters with aircraft, matching the exact specifications of what we had seen. The Coast Guard had received so many reports that they had issued an official statement acknowledging unusual aerial phenomena in the area. But most shocking of all were the reports of other objects being found. Apparently, whatever had visited the hilltop had left similar calling cards across multiple locations, and government investigators were already en route to collect and analyze the physical evidence. Armed with confirmation that our experiences were part of a larger phenomenon, Maya and I finally worked up the courage to approach Ms. Rodriguez with our story. We brought the metallic object with us, certain that physical evidence would convince her of the truth of our account. Her reaction was immediate and devastating. She listened to our description with growing skepticism, her expression shifting from professional concern to barely concealed irritation. When we produced the object, she examined it briefly before dismissing it as probably some kind of experimental weather monitoring device that had fallen from a research aircraft. "I've run this camp for 15 years, she said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Every summer I get at least one pair of counselors who claim to have seen something unusual in the woods. It's always the same thing. Isolation, stress, and overactive imaginations combining to create false memories of extraordinary events." She went on to explain that the island had a long history of unusual electromagnetic phenomena due to its unique geological composition, and that these natural effects often caused hallucinations and equipment malfunctions that could easily be mistaken for supernatural occurrences. No amount of argument could shake her certainty that we had experienced nothing more than stress-induced delusions. She confiscated the metallic object, claiming that it needed to be returned to whatever research institution had lost it, and warned us that any further discussion of alien encounters with the other staff or campers would result in our immediate dismissal. The other counselors' reactions were even worse. Word of our claims spread quickly through the camp's small community, and within hours we had become objects of ridicule and suspicion. Some viewed us as attention-seeking troublemakers, while others seemed genuinely concerned about our mental health. The few who claimed to believe us did so with the kind of patronizing sympathy typically reserved for small children afraid of monsters under their beds. The remaining weeks of our commitment stretched endlessly ahead of us. We couldn't leave without forfeiting our contracts and facing financial penalties we couldn't afford. So we were trapped on the island with people who viewed us as either liars or mentally unstable. The isolation became even more oppressive, and we found ourselves withdrawing from social interactions with the other staff members. But the worst part was the knowledge that something extraordinary and terrifying had occurred, and we were powerless to make anyone else acknowledge its reality. Every night we watched the skies, waiting for the craft to return. Every strange sound in the forest made us freeze with remembered terror. The experience had fundamentally altered our perception of reality, but we were forced to live as if nothing had happened. Maya began experiencing nightmares that left her screaming in her sleep. I developed a persistent anxiety that made it difficult to eat or concentrate on simple tasks. We both lost significant weight during our remaining time at the camp, and by the end of July, we looked like refugees from some unimaginable disaster. The ferry ride back to the mainland felt like an escape from prison, but the relief was temporary. In the years since leaving Cedar Point, neither Maya nor I has been able to fully process what we experienced on that remote island. The memory of those red lights and that impossible craft continues to haunt our dreams and intrude into our waking thoughts. I still have nightmares about that humming sound and the sensation of being examined by alien intelligence. Maya moved across the country shortly after we returned, claiming she needed a fresh start, but I know she's still running from the memories of what we witnessed together. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I find myself standing at my window and scanning the sky for any sign of 3 red lights arranged in a perfect triangle. Part of me hopes never to see them again, but another part a part I'm ashamed to acknowledge, waits for their return with a mixture of terror and desperate longing for validation. The object we found was never returned to us, and my attempts to locate it through official channels have been met with bureaucratic stonewalling and denial that any such evidence ever existed. The news reports that had seemed so promising at the time were quickly buried and forgotten, replaced by more conventional stories that didn't challenge people's comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality. 3 years later, I remain convinced that Maya and I witnessed something that defied conventional understanding of what is possible in our world. But I've learned to keep that conviction to myself, buried beneath layers of forced normalcy and careful silence. The truth, as they say, is out there, but sometimes the cost of seeking it is higher than anyone should have to pay. I will never return to Cedar Point, and I've made peace with the fact that I may never know the full truth about what we encountered on that distant hilltop. Some experiences are too large and too terrifying for the human mind to fully process, and perhaps ignorance truly is a form of mercy. But on clear nights, when the stars are bright and the world is still, I sometimes catch myself listening for that familiar humming sound, wondering if somewhere out there, beyond the comfortable boundaries of our small world, something is still watching and waiting with patient, inhuman intelligence. God help us all if they ever decide to make contact again. My name is Riley, and I'm 18 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened during the summer of 2024, and I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word is true. This isn't my first encounter with something unexplainable, but it was by far the worst. The memory still wakes me up at night, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Our family had been visiting Brunjuk Dam for water skiing trips since I was 7. The massive reservoir, nestled in the hills outside Brisbane, had always been our escape from the suffocating city heat. Mom would pack our gear with military precision while Dad checked the boat trailer for the 3rd time. My younger brother Connor would bounce around the house like a pinball, asking every 5 minutes if we were ready to leave yet. The drive always took 4 hours, winding through increasingly remote countryside until civilization seemed like a distant memory. That particular trip felt different from the moment we left our driveway. The radio kept cutting to static, despite Dad fiddling with the antenna. Mom seemed unusually quiet, staring out the passenger window with an expression I couldn't read. Even Connor had stopped his usual chatter after the first hour. By the time we reached the dam's entrance gates, darkness had swallowed the landscape whole. The security booth sat like a lonely island in a sea of black, its fluorescent light buzzing and flickering intermittently. The elderly guard who emerged looked like he hadn't smiled in decades, his weathered face mapped with deep lines that seemed to spell out warnings I couldn't understand. While my family handled the check-in process, I remained in the back seat, finishing a video on my phone. The screen's glow created a small bubble of normalcy in the growing unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. When the video ended, I looked up to survey our surroundings through the car windows. The dam stretched out before us, its dark surface reflecting nothing but void. Twisted eucalyptus trees lined the shoreline, their pale bark appearing almost skeletal in the weak light from the security booth. Something about the way they swayed in the windless night made my stomach clench. But it was more than just the trees. The entire place felt wrong, as if we had driven into somewhere we weren't supposed to be. That's when I first felt it watching me. The sensation started as a prickling at the base of my neck, the kind of awareness that makes every animal instinct scream danger. I turned slowly in my seat, scanning the tree line beyond the parking area. At first, I saw nothing but shadows layered upon shadows. Then, like a photograph developing in slow motion, I began to make out a shape that didn't belong. 2 points of red light hovered at what would be eye level for something impossibly tall. They weren't moving, just fixed on our car with an intensity that made my mouth go dry. I blinked hard, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I opened my eyes, those red points had moved closer. Panic rising in my throat, I spun around to look out the opposite window. and what I saw there nearly stopped my heart entirely. The thing stood no more than 10 feet from our car, close enough that I could make out details that would burn themselves into my memory forever. Its face was the color of old bone, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for any natural creature. But it was the eyes that held me frozen. They glowed like hot coals, not with any light source I could identify, but with something that seemed to come from within. The lower half of its face was the stuff of nightmares. Its jaw appeared to have been split down the middle, creating two separate mandibles that hung at unnatural angles. What I had initially thought was fur was actually patches of something dark and matted, clinging to gaunt limbs that looked like they might snap under their own weight. The creature's entire body twitched and jerked as if electricity was running through it in random bursts. Standing at least 9 feet tall, it loomed over our vehicle like some grotesque scarecrow brought to life. The moment I blinked, it vanished. Not gradually, not by stepping back into the shadows, but simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. When my family returned to the car, chattering about cabin arrangements and tomorrow's skiing plans, I tried to tell them what I had seen. But the words came out in a jumbled rush that made me sound like I was having some kind of breakdown. Dad glanced at me in the rearview mirror with concern, while Mom suggested I might be getting carsick from the long drive. Connor just rolled his eyes and muttered something about his dramatic older brother under his breath. Our cabin sat at the water's edge, a modest structure with large windows that faced the dam. During daylight hours, those windows would offer stunning views of the water and surrounding hills. But in the darkness, they became mirrors that reflected our lit interior while concealing whatever might be lurking outside. I couldn't shake the image of that creature from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those twin red flames staring back at me. Sleep became impossible as my mind raced through rational explanations. Maybe it had been a large dog with some kind of disease. Maybe the red eyes were just reflections from our car's taillights. Maybe I was more exhausted from the drive than I realized. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations fit what I had witnessed. Around 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely and moved to the window. The dam's surface was perfectly still, like a sheet of black glass. Moonlight created a narrow path across the water, but it only made the surrounding darkness seem deeper and more impenetrable. That's when I saw it again. The creature stood at the water's edge, maybe 50 yards from our cabin. This time, I had a clear view of its full height and the way it moved with an unsettling, jerky gait. It seemed to be pacing back and forth along the shoreline, occasionally stopping to turn its head in our direction. I grabbed Connor's shoulder and shook him awake, desperate to have someone else witness what I was seeing. He groaned and complained about being woken up, but I dragged him to the window anyway. By the time his eyes focused enough to look where I was pointing, the shoreline was empty again. "You're losing it," he mumbled, before stumbling back to his bed. "Probably just saw a kangaroo or something." But I knew kangaroos didn't stand 9 feet tall or have eyes that glowed like embers in the dark. The next morning brought brilliant sunshine and a perfect breeze for water skiing. Mom insisted that some fresh air and physical activity would cure whatever vacation jitters I was experiencing. Despite my protests, she had me suited up and ready to hit the water before I had finished my coffee. The lake was busier than I had ever seen it, dotted with boats of every size and color. Families were already out enjoying the morning calm, their laughter carrying across the water like music. For the first time since our arrival, I began to relax. Maybe Connor was right. Maybe I had just been tired and seeing things. Mom piloted our boat with her usual skill, carving smooth turns through the water while I rode behind on the kneeboard. The familiar rhythm of skiing began to work its magic, washing away the previous night's fears with each spray of cool water across my face. We headed toward the small island that sat in the dam's center, a popular turnaround point for skiers. As we approached, I signaled for Mom to pick up speed, wanting to feel the rush of cutting through the water at maximum velocity. That's when everything went wrong. The boat hit some kind of wake that seemed to come from nowhere, bouncing me so hard that my grip on the rope was torn away. I hit the water with enough force to drive the breath from my lungs, surfacing with my ears ringing and my vision blurred. I raised my hand in the standard signal for pickup, expecting to see Mom already turning the boat around. But when I looked toward where our boat should have been, I saw nothing but empty water. Every boat that had been dotting the lake just minutes before had vanished. The water was completely deserted, as if I had been transported to a different place entirely. I treaded water and spun in a complete circle, searching for any sign of life, but found only an unnatural silence that pressed down on me like a physical weight. I shouted for Mom until my throat was raw, but the sound seemed to be swallowed by the air itself, creating no echo, no response, nothing. The island, which had seemed so close when I fell, now appeared impossibly distant. No matter how hard I swam toward it, it never seemed to get any closer. Panic began to claw at my chest as I realized I might be trapped in open water with no way to reach shore. But panic turned to terror when I felt something brush against my leg beneath the surface. I woke up on the rocky shore as the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. My head throbbed, and my mouth tasted like I'd been chewing on copper pennies. I was wearing only my underwear, though I distinctly remembered going to bed fully clothed the night before. Confusion mixed with relief as I realized the boat incident must have been a dream. But if it was a dream, how had I ended up on the shoreline a quarter-mile from our cabin? The rocks beneath me were real enough, digging into my back with sharp persistence. Light scratches covered my chest and arms, as if I had been dragged through brambles. My feet were in terrible condition. The soles were torn and bloody, making each step an agony as I began the trek back to the cabin. Sharp stones and broken branches seemed to find every sensitive spot, forcing me to stop frequently to rest and assess the damage. During one of these stops, sitting on a boulder near the water's edge, I heard movement in the brush behind me. The sound was wrong somehow, too heavy and deliberate to be made by any native animal. When I turned to investigate, I saw it again. The creature stood perhaps 30 yards away, partially obscured by low-hanging branches. In daylight, it looked even more disturbing than it had in the darkness. What I had thought might be diseased fur was actually patches of something dark and oily that seemed to move independently of any breeze. Its pale skin was mottled with dark veins that pulsed visibly beneath the surface. But it was the smell that nearly made me vomit. Even at that distance, the stench of rot and something chemical sweet filled my nostrils. It was the smell of things that should have been buried long ago. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I called out to it. My voice cracked as I asked who it was, what it wanted. The creature's head snapped toward me with an unnatural speed that made my vision blur. For a moment, we stared at each other across that small clearing. Then it began to move. The creature didn't run toward me in any conventional sense. Instead, it moved through the trees with a fluid, almost liquid motion that defied everything I knew about anatomy and physics. One moment it was behind one tree, the next it had somehow flowed to another position entirely, always maintaining that fixed, burning stare. I ran. My already damaged feet sent lightning bolts of pain up my legs with each step, but terror pushed me beyond any physical limitation I had ever experienced. Behind me, the sound of branches breaking filled the air like gunshots. Whatever was pursuing me was large enough and strong enough to snap trees that would have stopped a charging bull. I dove behind the largest eucalyptus I could find, pressing my back against its rough bark and trying to control my ragged breathing. The breaking sounds had stopped, replaced by something far worse. Silence so complete, it felt like the world had died around me. Carefully, I peered around the tree trunk. The creature stood motionless about 20 yards away, its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. It was listening, or perhaps smelling the air, searching for any sign of my location. Then it began to make sounds. A series of clicks emanated from its throat, rapid and rhythmic like some alien Morse code. Beneath the clicking, a low moan built in volume and intensity, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost like speech. But if it was communication, it was in no language meant for human ears. The creature began moving again, this time heading toward a dense thicket near the base of a hill. My curiosity, That fatal flaw that had gotten me into trouble countless times before overrode my common sense. Despite every rational thought telling me to head straight back to the cabin, I found myself following at a distance. The trail it left was impossible to miss. Broken branches, deep gouges in the earth, and patches of that oily substance marked its passage like breadcrumbs leading into the heart of darkness itself. The creature led me to what could only be described as a den, though calling it that seemed inadequate for the horror I discovered. Carved into the hillside, partially natural cave and partially something that had been excavated by claws or tools, the opening yawned like a mouth ready to swallow the unwary. The creature had disappeared inside, leaving me alone at the entrance with a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I could turn around, go back to the cabin, and try to convince myself that none of this was real. Or I could step into that darkness and finally learn the truth about what I had been seeing. Curiosity won, as I somehow knew it always would. The stench hit me like a physical blow as soon as I crossed the threshold. It was the smell from earlier, but concentrated to an almost unbearable degree. Decay, chemicals, and something else I couldn't identify but that made my lizard brain scream warnings about disease and death. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, details began to emerge that turned my stomach and confirmed my worst fears. Bones were scattered across the floor of the cave, some clearly animal, but others that looked disturbingly human-like in their proportions. They had been gnawed and cracked, with marrow extracted in ways that spoke of both hunger and intelligence. But it was the collection of personal items that truly terrified me. Cell phones, wallets, jewelry, medication bottles, even articles of clothing were arranged around the cave's perimeter like trophies. Some looked recent, with screens still intact and leather still supple. Others appeared to have been there for months or even years, corroded and weathered by time and the cave's humid atmosphere. I picked up the nearest phone, hoping it might still have power for its flashlight function. The screen came to life immediately, and to my horror, music began blasting at full volume. The previous owner had left their media player running, and the sudden cacophony echoed through the cave like an alarm. I fumbled with the device, trying desperately to stop the sound, but it was too late. From somewhere deep in the cave's recesses came the sound of movement. Heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the main chamber where I stood frozen in terror. The clicking sound filled the air again, closer now and more agitated than before. Beneath it, that inhuman moaning rose to a pitch that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling behind a pile of debris as the creature entered the chamber. In the dim light filtering through the cave entrance, I could see the creature more clearly than ever before. What I had thought might be some kind of diseased animal was something far worse. The proportions were wrong in every way, as if someone had tried to build a human from memory, but had gotten all the details slightly off. Its movements were deliberate and intelligent as it searched the cave, checking each corner and crevice with the methodical precision of a hunter that knew its territory intimately. The clicking sounds it made seemed to serve as a kind of echolocation, allowing it to map the space around it even in near total darkness. I pressed myself deeper into my hiding spot, hardly daring to breathe as those red eyes swept the chamber. When they passed over my location, I felt a cold certainty that it knew exactly where I was and was simply choosing not to act immediately. Then, like a miracle sent from God himself, a beam of light pierced the cave entrance. Someone was outside with a powerful flashlight, calling out in a voice rough with years of tobacco use. The creature's head snapped toward the entrance, and in an instant, it was gone. Not fled, not hidden, but simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. The oppressive weight that had been crushing down on me lifted, and I could suddenly move again. I scrambled toward the entrance, bursting into the blessed darkness of night, where an old man in ranger's clothes stood with his flashlight. He took one look at my condition, bloody, half-naked, and clearly traumatized, and asked what had happened. When I tried to explain, he held up a weathered hand to stop me. His eyes held a knowledge that chilled me even more than the creature had. He knew. He had seen others like me before, others who had encountered what lived in these hills. "You're not the first," he said simply, "and you won't be the last. But if you know what's good for you, you'll never speak of this to anyone official. The rangers don't want to hear it, and the police sure as hell don't." He walked me back to the cabin, where my parents were waiting with worry etched deep in their faces. They had been searching for me for hours, unable to understand how I had simply vanished from my bed. I told them I had gotten lost trying to find the bathroom outside, a lie that satisfied no one but that we all agreed to accept. We left the next morning, cutting our vacation short by 3 days. During the drive home, I stared out the back window, watching Burnjuk Dam shrink in the distance. I told myself I was safe now, that whatever lived in those hills couldn't follow us back to the city. But that night, Connor came into my room with fear in his eyes that I recognized all too well. "Riley," he whispered, "there's something outside my window." When we looked out into our suburban backyard, we saw nothing but the usual garden and fence. But I knew that didn't mean we were safe. Some things, once they have your scent, never stop hunting. The scratches on my chest took weeks to heal, but the memory of those red eyes burning in the darkness will stay with me forever. I still wake up some nights, certain I can smell that chemical-sweet stench of decay, and I find myself checking and rechecking the locks on our doors and windows. They say curiosity killed the cat, but sometimes curiosity does worse than kill. Sometimes it shows you things that should stay hidden, things that prove the world is far stranger and more dangerous than we pretend it is. And sometimes those things follow you home. My name is Ewan Thibodeau. Back in 1998, I was just another grease monkey in Fallbrook, Oregon, population 2,317 and shrinking. This story isn't easy to tell, even all these years later. Sometimes I still wake up in cold sweat, hearing sounds that can't possibly be there, but I need to get it down to make sense of what happened that autumn in the mountains. I'd been working at Harmon's Auto Shop since dropping out of community college. The pay wasn't much, but I had a knack for diagnosing engine problems just by listening to them, like a doctor with a stethoscope. My hands were always stained with oil, black crescents under my fingernails that never quite washed away. The local folks brought their vehicles to me when the newer shop in the next town over couldn't figure out what was wrong. My apartment sat above Maureen's bakery, which meant I woke every morning to the smell of fresh bread. The rent was reasonable, and I had everything I needed. A small TV, a comfortable couch, and walls decorated with fishing trophies. Simple pleasures for a simple life. Or so I thought. Lyle Dunnigan had been my best friend since 3rd grade, when he punched Billy Alderson for making fun of my second-hand clothes. We'd been inseparable ever since. Now he worked at the lumber mill outside town, and we spent most weekends fishing at remote spots throughout the Cascade foothills. Lyle knew those woods like the back of his hand. His grandfather had been a forest ranger, and he'd passed all that knowledge down. It was mid-September when things started to feel off. I was working late at the shop, replacing the transmission on Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick. The radio played classic rock, mixing with the rhythmic clanking of my tools against metal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows in the garage. The door opened with a creak, letting in a gust of autumn air that smelled like pine and wet earth. Sheriff Vince Patterson stood in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. At 57, he'd been sheriff longer than anyone could remember, a fixture of Fallbrook as permanent as the mountains themselves. "Evening, Ewan," he said, removing his hat. His silver hair caught the light. "Got a minute?" I wiped my hands on a shop rag, leaving behind dark streaks. "Sure thing, Sheriff. Something wrong with your cruiser?" He shook his head, eyes darting to the corners of the garage. "No, nothing like that. Just wanted to ask if you've noticed anything unusual lately. Anything at all." The seriousness in his voice made me pause. "Not really. Why do you ask?" He sighed, shoulders sagging beneath his uniform. "We've got people missing, 3 in the last month." That got my attention. In Fallbrook, everyone knew everyone. 3 people missing was practically an epidemic. "Who?" I asked, setting down my wrench. "Couple of hikers from Portland went up near Sawmill Ridge 2 weeks back. Their cars still parked at the trailhead. And—" He paused, looking even more troubled. "Old Wilfred Simmons disappeared from his cabin 3 days ago." I knew Simmons. reclusive old-timer who lived in a cabin about 7 miles into the woods. He came into town once a month for supplies and always brought his truck to me for maintenance. Cranky but sharp as a tack despite being well into his 70s. You think he wandered off? Maybe got lost? Sheriff Patterson snorted. Simmons? Man's been living in those woods for 40 years. He doesn't get lost. He lowered his voice. His cabin was torn apart, Ewan, like something was looking for something, or someone. A chill crept up my spine despite the garage's warmth. Animal attack? That's what I thought at first, but it doesn't add up. His rifle was still on the wall rack, unfired. And the damage? He shook his head. Never seen anything like it. Claw marks 4 inches deep in solid oak beams. Bears can do some damage, I offered. Not like this, and not without leaving tracks. Ground around the cabin was dry as bone, not a single print. He put his hat back on. I've got search parties organized, but I want you to be careful if you're heading into the woods. You and Lyle still planning that fishing trip? I nodded. Next weekend, up to Blackwater Creek. His face darkened. That's not far from where the hikers went missing. Maybe consider another spot this time. We'll be fine, Sheriff. Been going there for years. He didn't look convinced. Just keep your eyes open, and maybe pack something besides fishing gear if you get my meaning. After he left, I tried to focus on the Buick, but my mind kept returning to our conversation. I'd grown up with stories about the dangers lurking in those mountains, bears, cougars, the occasional wolf, but something in the sheriff's voice suggested this was different. That night, I met Lyle at O'Malley's bar. The place was dim, smelling of stale beer and cigarettes despite the smoking ban. A few locals hunched over their drinks, voices low. Something felt subdued about the place, a tension hanging in the air. Lyle was already nursing a beer, his broad shoulders hunched over the bar. At 6'3" with hands like baseball mitts, he looked more like a professional wrestler than a sawmill worker. His red beard was neatly trimmed, contrasting with his flannel shirt. "You're late," he grunted as I slid onto the stool beside him. "Had to finish Mrs. Patterson's Buick." I signaled the bartender. "Sheriff stopped by the shop today." Lyle raised an eyebrow. "About what?" I lowered my voice. "People going missing, hikers and old man Simmons. Heard about that." He took a long pull from his beer. "Mill's been buzzing with talk. Myers thinks it's some serial killer hiding out in the woods." "What do you think?" Lyle shrugged. "Could be anything. Simmons wasn't exactly stable. Maybe he finally lost it completely. Sheriff said his cabin was torn apart. Claw marks in the wood." Lyle's expression shifted subtly. "Bear, probably." "That's what I said. He didn't think so." The bartender set a beer in front of me. I took a sip, the bitter taste doing little to wash away my unease. "We still on for Blackwater next weekend?" Lyle asked. I hesitated. Sheriff suggested we pick another spot. Lyle snorted. "Since when do we listen to Patterson? Remember when he tried to tell us Thunder Ridge was closed because of dangerous conditions? We went anyway and caught the biggest rainbow trout I've ever seen." "This feels different," I said. "It's just the same old bullshit. They always try to scare people away from the good spots." He finished his beer and set the glass down with finality. "We're going to Blackwater. Best fishing this time of year, and I need a break from the mill." I knew better than to argue when Lyle had made up his mind. Besides, he was probably right. People got lost in the woods all the time, especially city folks who underestimated the wilderness. And Simmons? Well, who knew what had happened there? The old man had enemies, and his mind had been slipping lately. "Fine," I conceded. "But we're bringing my dad's old rifle." Lyle grinned. "Now you're talking." As we discussed details for the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us through the grimy bar windows. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but darkness beyond the glass, the reflection of hanging lights obscuring whatever might be out there. That night, I dreamed of deep woods and distorted howls echoing between ancient trees. I woke gasping for breath, sheets soaked with sweat, the memory of glowing eyes fading as consciousness returned. I told myself it was just my imagination, stirred up by the sheriff's warnings. I had no idea how terribly, fatally wrong I was. The week dragged on with an oppressive heaviness. More whispers circulated through town about the disappearances. Another hiker vanished, a college student named Wesley Mitchell, who'd been camping alone near Timber Lake. His backpack was found hanging from a tree branch 20 feet off the ground, contents scattered across the forest floor. No one could explain how it got there. I was replacing spark plugs in a Honda when Marla Simmons, Wilfred's niece, came into the shop. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail. "Ewan," she said, voice cracking, "have you heard anything about Uncle Will?" I set down my tools and wiped my hands. "Nothing new. Sheriff's still looking." She nodded, blinking back tears. "They found his boots yesterday, just his boots, sitting neatly by the creek like he'd taken them off to wade. No footprints, nothing else." I didn't know what to say. Marla and I had dated briefly in high school before realizing we were better as friends. She worked as a nurse at the county clinic now. "They'll find him," I offered lamely. "No, they won't." Her certainty was chilling. "Something's happening in those woods, Ewan, something bad. The clinic's been getting strange cases, hunters coming in with deep scratches they can't explain, hikers with memory loss who can't account for missing hours." "Could be anything," I said. "Bears, mountain lions." "It's not animals," she interrupted. "The wound patterns are all wrong, and there's something else." She lowered her voice. "The missing aren't all strangers. Before the hikers, before Uncle Will, there was Ben Kovach." Ben had been the town drunk, a fixture on the bench outside the liquor store. I hadn't seen him around lately, but hadn't thought much about it. "Ben left town all the time on benders," I said. "Not like this. They found his shopping cart by the river trail, bottles untouched. Ben never left alcohol behind." Her eyes met mine. "Sheriff Patterson is keeping it quiet to avoid panic, but I heard them talking at the clinic. 6 people missing in total." 6 people. A chill settled in my stomach. "You and Lyle still going fishing this weekend?" she asked. "Yeah, up to Blackwater." Her face paled. "Don't. Please, Ewan. Uncle Will's cabin is only 3 miles from there." "We'll be careful," I assured her. "We're bringing protection." She shook her head in frustration. "You men are all the same. Think a gun makes you invincible." She turned to leave, then paused. "At least promise you'll stay alert and keep your radio on." "I promise," I said. After she left, I tried calling Lyle to suggest changing our plans, but he didn't answer, probably working the late shift at the mill. I left a message mentioning what Marla had told me, hoping he might reconsider. That evening, I stopped by the sheriff's office. Deputy Walsh sat at the front desk, looking exhausted. "Sheriff around?" I asked. "Out with the search party," Walsh replied. "Probably won't be back until late." "Any news about the missing people?" Walsh's expression darkened. "Nothing good. Found some torn clothing belonging to one of the hikers, shredded to ribbons." He leaned forward. "Between you and me, I've never seen damage like that. Not from any animal I know." "What do you think it is?" He shrugged. "Sheriff's called in some wildlife experts from the State Department. They're setting up cameras around the search areas." As I turned to leave, Walsh called after me. "Hey, Ewan, you carrying when you're in the woods these days?" I nodded. "Good. Make sure it's loaded." On Friday morning, Lyle finally called. "Got your message," he said without preamble. "Still going to Blackwater. Lyle, 6 people are missing now. Maybe we should—" "That's exactly why we need to go," he cut in. "I've been talking to some of the guys at the mill. Something weird's going on in those woods, and it's not just hikers getting lost." "What do you mean?" There was a pause. "Brett's cousin works for the Forest Service. Said they found animal carcasses all through the eastern range, deer, elk, even a black bear, all torn apart but not eaten." "Could be poachers," I suggested. "Poachers don't leave the meat behind, and they don't do—" His voice dropped. "What was done to these animals? And that's supposed to convince me to go fishing?" "We're not just going fishing, Ewan. I want to see for ourselves what's happening up there, Brett's cousin marked locations on a map where they found the carcasses. There's a pattern. My chest tightened. What kind of pattern? They're all in a rough circle, and Blackwater Creek is right at the center. I should have said no. Should have told him he was crazy. But curiosity mixed with a strange sense of duty. If something was happening in our woods, didn't we have a responsibility to find out what? Fine, I said finally. But we're bringing every weapon we can carry. Already ahead of you. I'll pick you up at dawn tomorrow. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. I closed the shop early and went home to pack. I pulled my father's Remington 870 shotgun from the closet, along with a box of shells. The gun had been gathering dust since Dad passed 5 years earlier, but I'd kept it clean and functional. As I cleaned the barrel one last time, the local news played on the TV. The anchor was talking about the unprecedented number of disappearances in the Fallbrook area. They showed photos of the missing, the 2 Portland hikers, college student Wesley Mitchell, Old Man Simmons, Ben Kovach, and someone I hadn't heard about, a forest ranger named Andrea Phillips. The report cut to Sheriff Patterson giving a statement, urging people to avoid remote areas until further notice. Behind his professional demeanor, I could see the strain in his eyes. He knew something he wasn't saying. I tried calling Marla to let her know where we'd be, but only got her voicemail. I left a detailed message with our planned route and promised to check in by radio. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Dreams of dark woods and watching eyes plagued me. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I was running through a moonlit forest, something massive crashing through the underbrush behind me. I could hear its rasping breath, feel its hunger like a physical weight pressing down. I woke with a strangled gasp at 4 a.m., sheets drenched in sweat. Dawn arrived with a blanket of fog so thick I could barely see the end of my street. A bad omen, I thought, but pushed the idea away. I wasn't superstitious. Not then, anyway. Lyle pulled up in his battered truck at 5:30, right on time. The bed was loaded with our usual fishing gear, plus additions that spoke to our unease. Extra flashlights, first aid kits, a larger tent than usual, and what looked like enough food for a week rather than a weekend. "Ready?" he asked as I loaded my shotgun into the truck. He had his grandfather's lever-action Marlin propped against the passenger seat. "As I'll ever be," I replied, climbing in. We drove in silence for the first few miles, the fog parting before our headlights only to close again behind us. The radio played softly, some morning show discussing the search for the missing hikers. "They're saying it might be a serial killer," Lyle said eventually. "Some psycho living in the woods. You believe that?" He shrugged, eyes fixed on the road. "Easier to believe than the alternatives." "Which are?" "Something not human." His voice was flat, matter-of-fact. I glanced at him. Lyle had always been the pragmatic one, feet firmly planted in reality. This kind of talk wasn't like him. "Since when do you believe in monsters?" I asked. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "My grandfather used to tell stories, native legends about something in these mountains. Called it the Windwalker. Said it would come during certain years when the stars aligned a certain way. Take people." "Your grandfather also believed the government was putting mind-control drugs in the water supply," I reminded him. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair point." We turned onto the logging road that would take us most of the way to Blackwater Creek. The truck bounced over potholes and ruts, gravel pinging against the undercarriage. "Sheriff ever say what happened at Simmons' cabin?" Lyle asked. "Not details, just that it was torn apart. Marla mentioned they found his boots by the creek." Lyle frowned. "Just the boots?" I nodded. "That's not normal, Ewan. None of this is normal." The logging road ended at a small clearing. From here, we'd hike about 3 miles to our usual spot. We unloaded the truck in silence, shouldering our packs and gripping our fishing rods. Both of us kept our firearms readily accessible. The fog had thinned somewhat, but visibility in the forest was still poor. Moisture dripped from pine needles overhead, creating a constant patter like gentle rain. Our boots squelched in the damp earth as we followed the familiar trail. "Someone's been through here recently," Lyle said, pointing to fresh boot prints in the mud. Big prints. Size 13 at least. Search party, maybe? Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. We hiked deeper into the woods, the mist swirling around ancient trees. For the first time in years, these familiar woods felt alien, unwelcoming. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. About halfway to our destination, Lyle suddenly stopped. "You smell that?" I sniffed the air. Beyond the usual forest scents of pine, earth, and decaying vegetation was something else. A sour, musty odor like rotting meat and wet fur. "What is that?" I whispered. Lyle slowly reached for his rifle. "I don't know, but it's not right." We stood perfectly still, listening. The forest had gone silent. No bird song, no chattering squirrels. Nothing but the soft drip of moisture from the trees. The silence itself felt wrong, heavy with anticipation. Then, far off to our right, came a sound that made my skin crawl. A low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a cougar. Something else. "Move," Lyle hissed. Slowly. We continued down the trail, alert to every sound, every movement. The oppressive feeling of being watched intensified with each step. Twice more we heard that strange growl, closer each time. Near a bend in the trail, Lyle suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing to a massive oak tree. Deep gouges ran along the trunk, 4 parallel lines that couldn't have been made by any normal forest animal. The cuts were fresh, sap still oozing from the wounded wood. "We should go back," I said, fear finally overriding curiosity. Lyle shook his head. "We're closer to the creek than the truck now. Besides," he hefted his rifle, "I want to know what we're dealing with." Against my better judgment, I followed him. We reached Blackwater Creek an hour later, emerging from the forest onto the rocky shore. The water ran high and fast with recent rains, dark and foreboding under the gray sky. Our usual camping spot lay in a small clearing about 50 yards upstream. As we approached, Lyle suddenly threw out an arm to stop me. "Something's not right," he whispered. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Our clearing had been used. Recently. The fire pit we'd built years ago contained fresh ashes. Surrounding it were odd arrangements of stones and sticks in patterns that made no sense. And hanging from a nearby tree branch was what appeared to be a mesh sack containing small bones. "What the hell?" I breathed. Lyle approached the site cautiously, rifle ready. "Someone's been staying here." "Homeless person, maybe," I suggested, knowing it was unlikely this far into the wilderness. He shook his head, examining the strange arrangements. "This is ritualistic." A cold dread settled over me. "Lyle, we need to go." He nodded, finally seeming to accept the danger. "Yeah, let's." A branch snapped in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, weapons raised. Nothing visible moved among the trees, but that terrible stench had returned stronger than before, and with it came a sound that haunts my nightmares to this day, a wet, clicking noise, like bones being snapped and reset. "Run," Lyle whispered. "Now." We turned and sprinted along the creek bank, abandoning any pretense of courage. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal we knew. As we ran, the clicking sound followed, accompanied by heavy footfalls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "There," Lyle pointed to a rocky outcrop ahead. "We can defend that position." We scrambled up the rocks, gaining about 15 feet of elevation. From here, we had a clear view of the surrounding area. We stood back to back, weapons ready, scanning the tree line. "See anything?" I panted. "No, but it's out there. Watching." The minutes stretched into an hour. The strange sounds had stopped, but that horrible stench lingered. Eventually, we made a decision. "We make for the truck," Lyle said. "Stay in the open as much as possible." I nodded, throat too dry to speak. We descended the rocks carefully and began moving upstream, staying close to the water and away from the tree line. The fog had lifted somewhat, but the forest remained a wall of shadows to our right. We'd covered perhaps half a mile when Lyle suddenly stopped. Look, he said, pointing across the creek. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by ferns, was a backpack. The same type carried by the missing college student, Wesley Mitchell. We should check it out, Lyle said. Are you insane? We need to get back to the truck and tell the sheriff. He hesitated, then nodded. You're right, let's... His words were cut off by a horrific sound from the forest, not a growl this time, but a high, keening wail that sounded disturbingly human, yet impossibly wasn't. It raised the hair on my arms and sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. Run, I shouted. We bolted, no longer caring about stealth or dignity. Pure animal fear drove us forward, the wailing growing louder behind us. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Something was moving through the trees, something tall and impossibly fast. I caught only glimpses. A flash of matted fur, the glint of eyes, the suggestion of limbs that seemed too long and jointed wrong. Don't look back, Lyle shouted. Just run. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Somehow we found the trail back to the truck and followed it blindly, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. The thing behind us never quite caught up but never fell far behind either, as if it was toying with us. When the truck finally came into view, it felt like a miracle. We threw ourselves inside, Lyle fumbling with the keys as I slammed and locked my door. The engine roared to life and we fishtailed out of the clearing, spewing gravel and mud. As we sped away, I finally allowed myself to look back. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. In the split second before it retreated into the shadows, I saw enough to know that our world had changed forever. What I saw couldn't exist, but it did. Neither of us spoke until we were back on the main highway, putting miles between ourselves and whatever lurked in those woods. We need to tell the sheriff, I finally said, voice shaking. Lyle nodded, face ashen. Yeah, but you and... What? Will he believe us? I had no answer for that. I wasn't sure I believed what I'd seen myself. We went straight to Sheriff Patterson's house, rather than the station. This wasn't something to discuss in front of deputies and dispatch operators. The sheriff answered his door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, coffee mug in hand. His expression shifted from annoyed to concerned as he took in our disheveled, terrified state. Inside, he said, stepping back. Now. We sat at his kitchen table while his wife, Rose, made fresh coffee. Neither of us touched our mugs when she set them down. The sheriff dismissed her with a gentle touch on the arm, and she retreated upstairs, casting worried glances over her shoulder. Start from the beginning, he said once we were alone. We took turns explaining what had happened, from the strange markings on the trees to the ritualistic site at our camping spot, to the thing that had chased us. I could tell from the sheriff's expression that he believed us, which was somehow more terrifying than if he'd dismissed our story. When we finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. Then he reached for the phone. Who are you calling? Lyle asked. State Police, Forest Service, maybe the FBI. You believe us? I couldn't keep the surprise from my voice. Sheriff Patterson's eyes met mine. Son, I've lived in these mountains all my life. There are things in the deep woods that don't have names, things the native folks knew to leave alone. I thought they were just stories until Simmons disappeared. He dialed a number, spoke briefly to someone named Barnes, then hung up. State Police will be here in 2 hours. Forest Service is already mobilizing teams to search the area around Blackwater Creek. Search teams won't be enough, Lyle said quietly. Whatever that thing is, it's dangerous, smart, and fast. The sheriff nodded grimly. I know. That's why I'm organizing a hunting party, experienced locals who know the terrain and can handle themselves in a fight. Count us in, I said immediately, surprising myself. After what we'd seen, the logical response would be to get as far from Fallbrook as possible. But something in me couldn't just run away, not with people still missing, not with that thing still out there. Lyle nodded his agreement. We know where it was. We can lead you back. Sheriff Patterson studied us for a moment, then nodded. Get some rest. We move out at first light tomorrow. And boys, his voice grew solemn, tell no one else what you saw. Last thing we need is panic spreading through town. We agreed and left, heading to Lyle's place since it was closer. Neither of us wanted to be alone. We showered, ate mechanically, and tried to process what had happened. Words felt inadequate for the terror we'd experienced. "What do you think it was?" I finally asked as we sat on his porch, beers in hand. Lyle shook his head. "Nothing natural. Nothing that should exist." "Your grandfather's windwalker?" He shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe there are things in this world we're not meant to understand." I called Marla to let her know we were back safely, but kept the details vague. "We got spooked and came back early," I told her. "Sheriff's organizing another search party tomorrow." "Be careful," she said, voice tight with worry. "There's something wrong out there, Ewan. The clinic admitted 2 more hunters today with strange injuries, deep puncture wounds that the doctor says look like oversized teeth marks." Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, interrupted by nightmares. In the worst one, I was back in the forest, but alone this time. I could hear Lyle screaming somewhere in the darkness, begging for help. I ran toward his voice, only to find myself in a clearing illuminated by moonlight. In the center stood not Lyle, but the creature, taller than any man, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles and a face that was almost but not quite animal. It smiled at me with too many teeth and spoke with Lyle's voice, "You're next." I woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat. Dawn was just breaking, pale light filtering through the blinds. Time to face the woods again. 19 men gathered at the sheriff's office by 6 a.m. Most were locals I knew, mill workers, farmers, a few hunters known for their tracking skills. They carried an arsenal of rifles, shotguns, and handguns. A few had brought more unusual weapons. One old-timer had a crossbow, another clutched what looked like a homemade flamethrower constructed from a propane tank. Sheriff Patterson arrived last, accompanied by 2 state police officers and a wildlife expert from the Forest Service. He outlined the plan. We would form 4 teams and approach the Blackwater Creek area from different directions, maintaining radio contact at all times. If anyone spotted anything unusual, they were to signal the others and hold position until backup arrived. "We're dealing with something dangerous," the sheriff concluded, "possibly a rabid bear or wolf pack, possibly—" He hesitated. "Something else. Shoot first, ask questions later. But for God's sake, make sure you're not shooting at another team member." Lyle and I were assigned to the sheriff's team, along with Deputy Walsh and a local hunter named Donovan Reed, who claimed to have seen strange things in these woods for years. We would approach from the west, following the same trail Lyle and I had taken the day before. The drive to the trailhead was tense and quiet. Equipment rattled in the back of the sheriff's SUV as we bounced along the logging road. When we reached the clearing where Lyle had parked yesterday, we found 3 other vehicles already there, search parties that had started at dawn, looking for the missing hikers. "Any sign of the search teams?" Sheriff Patterson asked a Forest Service ranger who was coordinating from a temporary command post. The ranger shook his head. "They radioed in about an hour ago from the North Ridge. Nothing so far." We set out on the trail, moving slowly and deliberately. Sheriff Patterson and Deputy Walsh led, followed by Lyle and me, with Reed bringing up the rear. Every sense was heightened, alert to the smallest sound or movement. The forest seemed normal today. Birds called, squirrels chattered overhead. But we all felt the underlying wrongness, a subtle disturbance in the natural rhythm. We reached the point where Lyle and I had first smelled that terrible odor. Today the air was clean, carrying only the usual forest scents. "The markings were here," Lyle said, pointing to the massive oak. The sheriff examined the deep gouges in the bark. "These weren't made by any bear I've ever seen." Reed ran his fingers over the marks. "Too high up for a bear anyway. Whatever made these was tall, 7, 8 feet at least." We continued toward Blackwater Creek, moving even more cautiously now. I felt exposed, vulnerable, certain that eyes were watching from the shadows between trees. My shotgun felt inadequate against the memory of what I'd glimpsed the day before. When we neared the camping area, Sheriff Patterson signaled for us to stop and spread out. We advanced in a loose semicircle, weapons ready. The site appeared exactly as Lyle and I had left it. Fire pit with old ashes, strange arrangements of stones and sticks. the mesh sack of bones still hanging from the tree branch. The sheriff examined everything carefully, taking photographs with a small camera. "This isn't random," he muttered. "These patterns mean something." Reed nodded in agreement. "Old symbols. Protective wards, maybe." At our questioning looks, he added, "My grandmother was half Klamath. She knew these things." Walsh checked his radio. "Other teams are in position. No sightings reported." The sheriff made a decision. "We'll follow the creek upstream. That's where you boys saw the backpack, right?" We nodded and led the way, staying close to the water as we had yesterday. The creek burbled peacefully, sunlight dancing on its surface. It seemed impossible that anything sinister could exist in such a tranquil setting. We found the backpack exactly where we'd seen it, partially hidden by ferns on the opposite bank. Deputy Walsh crossed the creek at a shallow point and retrieved it. "Mitchell's," he confirmed, checking the ID in a side pocket. "Looks like it's been here a while. Weather damage." The sheriff nodded grimly. "Keep looking. There might be other signs." We spread out, searching the area methodically. I was examining a fallen log when Lyle called out from further upstream. "Got something?" We converged on his position. He stood at the edge of a small clearing, pointing to the ground. A hiking boot lay on its side, caked with dried mud. Not far away was its mate, placed neatly upright against a rock. "Simmons?" I asked. The sheriff nodded. "Matches the description." But it was what lay beyond the boots that made my blood run cold. The clearing floor was covered with a complex pattern of intertwined circles drawn in what looked like ash. At the center stood a crude wooden structure, a tripod of branches about 6 feet tall, from which hung various objects. Bits of cloth, small bones, feathers, and something that looked horribly like human teeth. "What the hell?" Walsh whispered. Reed approached the structure cautiously. "This is old magic. Very old. Whoever, or whatever, made this is trying to open something." "Open what?" Lyle asked. Reed's expression was grim. "A doorway." The sheriff was about to respond when his radio crackled. A voice broke through, distorted by static. "Team 3 to sheriff. We found..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched squeal. "Team 3 report," the sheriff said urgently. "Team 3, do you copy?" Nothing but static. "That's Morgan's team," Walsh said. "They were checking the eastern ridge." Sheriff Patterson tried again. "Any team, do you copy? This is Sheriff Patterson. We have lost contact with Team 3. After a moment, another voice responded through heavy static. "Team 4 here. We hear you. No contact with Team 3. Our radio's acting up too. Lot of interference suddenly." The sheriff looked troubled. "Team 4, proceed to Team 3's last known position. Approach with caution and report what you find." "Copy that," came the crackled reply. Reed was staring into the forest beyond the clearing, body tense. "We should leave. Now." "What's wrong?" I asked. "We're being watched." I felt it too. That same crawling sensation I'd experienced yesterday, like invisible eyes assessing us from every direction. The birds had gone silent again. The forest held its breath. Then we heard it, that same wet, clicking sound that had pursued us before, coming from somewhere to our left. "Move back toward the creek," Sheriff Patterson ordered quietly. "Stay together." We began retreating slowly, weapons trained on the surrounding forest. The clicking grew louder, joined by a low growl that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. 20 yards from the bizarre structure, Reed suddenly froze. "There," he whispered, pointing. At first I saw nothing. Then a shadow within shadows moved. A suggestion of form that made no logical sense. It wasn't hiding behind a tree. It was somehow part of the tree, or the tree was part of it. The boundaries between creature and forest blurred in a way that hurt my eyes to focus on. "What is that?" Walsh hissed. Before anyone could answer, the radio erupted with frantic voices. "It's here, God, it's... Shoot it, shoot! Can't get a clear... Fall back, fall!" Then only static. "Team 4!" Sheriff Patterson shouted into the radio. "Report!" Nothing. The clicking sound intensified, surrounding us now. The shadows between trees seemed to deepen, swirl, take form. That terrible stench returned, choking and thick. "Run!" Reed suddenly shouted. "Back to the trail, now!" We ran, abandoning any pretense of controlled retreat. Something crashed through the underbrush behind us, something large and fast. I heard Lyle firing his rifle, the shots echoing through the trees. Sheriff Patterson and Walsh joined in, firing blindly into the pursuing shadows. I ran until my lungs burned, jumping over fallen logs and crashing through thickets. Branches whipped at my face, drawing blood. Behind me, I heard a scream. Deputy Walsh's voice cut off mid-cry. "Keep going," the sheriff shouted. "Don't stop." We reached the main trail and sprinted toward the trailhead. Reed was in front, followed by me, then Lyle, with the sheriff bringing up the rear. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant, but we didn't slow down. The clearing with our vehicles came into sight. The Forest Service ranger stood by the command post, looking alarmed at our panicked arrival. "Where are the others?" he demanded. "Walsh is down," Sheriff Patterson gasped. "Teams 3 and 4 not responding." The ranger grabbed his radio. "All search teams, emergency evacuation, return to base immediately. Repeat, emergency evacuation." We collapsed against the vehicles, gasping for breath. Only then did I realize Reed was clutching his arm, blood seeping between his fingers. "What happened?" I asked. He pulled his hand away to reveal 3 deep gashes running from shoulder to elbow. "It got close, very close." Sheriff Patterson examined the wounds. "Those aren't claw marks," he said quietly. "They look like cuts, deliberate ones." Reed nodded grimly. "It's intelligent. Hunting us." The ranger brought a first aid kit and began cleaning Reed's wounds. "What was it? Bear? Mountain lion?" Lyle laughed bitterly. "If only." Over the next hour, other search teams trickled back, all reporting strange sounds and sensations of being watched. Team 2 had found another ritualistic site similar to the one we'd discovered, but Teams 3 and 4 never returned. 12 men vanished as completely as the hikers they'd been searching for. Sheriff Patterson organized a larger, better-armed group to go back for Walsh and the missing teams. Lyle and I volunteered again, unable to abandon our people despite the terror clawing at our insides. By mid-afternoon, 30 armed men ventured back into the forest. This time we moved as a single unit, a wall of weapons facing outward in all directions. The forest remained unnaturally quiet, the only sounds our own footsteps and breathing. We found Walsh's body first, or what remained of it. I won't describe what we saw. Some images are better left unshared. Sheriff Patterson's face went ashen, but he ordered us to continue. We had to find the other teams. We searched until dusk, finding nothing but empty forest and an occasional blood trail that ended abruptly. As darkness approached, the sheriff made the hard decision to retreat. We couldn't risk being in these woods after nightfall. Back at the command post, state police had arrived in force, along with FBI agents and more Forest Service personnel. The area was declared a crime scene, with roadblocks established on all access roads. The official story released to the press spoke of a possible serial killer operating in the woods, or perhaps a pack of rabid wolves. Those of us who had seen the truth knew better. This was something outside human experience, something ancient and malevolent that had awakened in our forests. Sheriff Patterson gathered those who had directly encountered the entity, Lyle, Reed, myself, and a few others who had glimpsed it from Team 2. "Whatever this is," he said, voice heavy with fatigue and grief, "it's beyond conventional law enforcement. I've spoken to some people who might be able to help, specialists in unusual phenomena. They're flying in tonight." "What do we do until then?" Lyle asked. "We prepare," Reed answered before the sheriff could speak. "It's established a hunting territory. It won't stay in the deep woods forever." A chill ran through me at the implication. "You think it will come to town?" Reed's eyes met mine. "I think nowhere is safe anymore." The specialists arrived just before midnight. 3 serious-looking men and a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Eleanor Weiss, an anthropologist specializing in folklore and unexplained phenomena. They set up operations in a back room of the sheriff's office, pinning maps to the walls and unpacking equipment I didn't recognize. Dr. Weiss interviewed each of us who had encountered the creature, recording our descriptions and asking detailed questions about its behavior. When we had finished, she conferred with her colleagues in low voices. "What are we dealing with?" Sheriff Patterson finally asked. Dr. Weiss chose her words carefully. The entity you've encountered has characteristics consistent with certain predatory cryptids documented across cultural boundaries. The ritualistic elements suggest it possesses some form of intelligence and purpose beyond mere hunting. In English, please, Lyle said. One of her colleagues, a gray-haired man named Blackburn, spoke bluntly. It's a predator that's existed in these mountains for centuries, possibly millennia. Native tribes had various names for it. European settlers occasionally encountered it and incorporated it into their own folklore. It hibernates for long periods, awakening when certain conditions are met. What conditions? I asked. That's what we're trying to determine, Dr. Weiss said. Often these creatures are triggered by environmental changes, human activity in previously undisturbed areas, or certain celestial alignments. Reed, who had been silent until now, spoke up. The lumber company started clear-cutting a new section of the eastern ridge last month. Ancient forest, never been touched before. Dr. Weiss nodded. That could very well be the trigger. How do we kill it? Sheriff Patterson asked. The specialists exchanged glances. Conventional weapons may injure it, Blackburn said carefully, but probably won't be sufficient to destroy it. These entities typically have specific vulnerabilities that vary by individual creature. So we're screwed, Lyle muttered. Not necessarily, Dr. Weiss said. The ritualistic sites you discovered may provide clues. The entity is creating these for a reason, possibly to strengthen itself, possibly as part of a larger purpose. If we can disrupt these sites and understand their meaning, we might find its weakness. Plans were made for the following day. 2 teams would venture back into the forest, one to examine and possibly dismantle the ritualistic sites, another to try tracking the creature to its lair. Both would be heavily armed with conventional weapons, plus some specialized equipment the team had brought. I volunteered for the tracking team, along with Lyle, Reed, and several experienced hunters from town. Sheriff Patterson would lead the other team with Dr. Weiss and her colleagues. We would maintain constant radio contact, with a large backup force standing by at the trailhead. That night, no one slept well. I stayed at Lyle's again, both of us keeping our weapons close. We talked little, each lost in our own thoughts. Around 3 a.m. we heard howling from the distant mountains, not wolves, not coyotes, but that same unnaturally deep, guttural cry we'd heard in the woods. It was closer to town than before. It's moving, Lyle said quietly. Morning came with heavy fog and a light drizzle, perfect conditions for something to hide. We gathered at the sheriff's office, checking weapons and equipment. The mood was grim, determined. These were no longer search parties looking for missing hikers. This was a war party hunting a killer. Dr. Weiss approached me before we left. Your descriptions of the entity were the most detailed, she said. You seem to be particularly attuned to it somehow. Lucky me, I said bitterly. She handed me a small object, a stone pendant on a leather cord. Ancient symbols were carved into its surface, similar to those we'd seen in the ritualistic sites. Wear this, she said. It may provide some protection, or at least make you less visible to it. You believe in this stuff? I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. Her expression remained serious. After 20 years studying these phenomena, I've learned to use every possible advantage. Whether it works through psychological suggestion or genuine metaphysical properties doesn't matter if it keeps you alive. I put the pendant around my neck, feeling slightly foolish but unwilling to reject any potential help. Our team set out just after 8 a.m. The forest felt different today, heavier, more oppressive. The fog limited visibility to about 30 yards, transforming familiar trees into looming shadows. Sounds were muffled, disorienting. We split up at the main trail junction, Sheriff Patterson's team heading toward Blackwater Creek while we veered northeast, following tracks discovered by the state police yesterday. Reed led our group, moving with surprising stealth despite his injured arm. The rest of us followed in single file, alert to every sound and movement. The tracks led us toward an area locally known as Deadfall Basin, a remote valley where an old landslide had created a jumble of massive boulders and fallen trees. Few people ventured there. The terrain was treacherous, with sudden drop-offs and unstable ground. Perfect place for something to hide, Reed murmured as we approached the basin's edge. We descended carefully into the fog-shrouded valley. Visibility dropped to mere feet in places, the mist swirling around shattered tree trunks and moss-covered rocks. Water dripped constantly from above, creating an eerie percussion. About halfway into the basin, Reed halted suddenly, raising a hand for silence. We froze, straining to hear what had alerted him. Nothing but the dripping water and our own breathing. Then I smelled it. That distinctive putrid odor. It was everywhere around us, embedded in the mist itself. "We're in its territory," Reed whispered. Lyle gestured ahead where the fog seemed to thin slightly. "There's a clearing up there." We advanced with agonizing slowness, testing each step before committing our weight. The clearing gradually emerged from the mist, a roughly circular space about 50 yards across, surrounded by towering pines and massive boulders. What we found there haunts me still. The clearing had been transformed into a massive version of the ritualistic sites we'd seen previously. Concentric circles of stones radiated outward from a central point where a structure stood, not a simple tripod this time, but an elaborate framework of branches and bones that rose nearly 20 feet high. Hanging from this macabre construction were personal effects from the missing: backpacks, clothing, equipment, and other things. Human things. I won't describe them. The ground beneath the structure was stained dark, the earth churned and wet. Several smaller arrangements surrounded it. Stones placed in specific patterns, sticks forming complex symbols. "My God," one of the hunters whispered. Reed approached the central structure cautiously. "This is its nest, its altar." He examined the symbols etched into the bones. "It's building something, growing stronger." Lyle keyed his radio. "Sheriff, we found something. Deadfall Basin. You need to see this." Static answered him. He tried again with the same result. "Radios won't work here," Reed said. "Not this close to its power center." I felt something then, a pressure in my head, a presence pushing against my consciousness. The pendant around my neck grew warm against my skin. "It knows we're here," I said. The others looked at me sharply. "How do you know?" Lyle asked. I couldn't explain it, just a certainty that filled me. "It's coming! Fast!" Reed's face hardened. "Destroy it! Destroy the structure! Now!" We didn't question him. Moving with desperate energy, we attacked the grotesque altar, pulling down branches, scattering bones, disrupting the careful arrangements of stones and symbols. The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature plummeted, the fog thickened, swirling violently around us. That wet, clicking sound erupted from all directions at once, punctuated by howls of rage that seemed to shake the earth itself. "Form a circle," Reed shouted. "Backs together." We complied, 8 men standing shoulder to shoulder, weapons pointed outward into the churning mist. The clicking intensified, moving rapidly around us, drawing closer with each circuit. "I see it!" someone shouted. I followed his aim and caught a glimpse of something moving through the fog, taller than a man with a silhouette that seemed to shift and change even as I watched. It vanished before anyone could fire. "There!" Another call from the opposite direction. Again, just a glimpse, a suggestion of limbs, an impression of eyes reflecting light that shouldn't have been there in the fog-shrouded clearing. "It's toying with us," Reed said, "hunting us." One of the hunters, a man named Garrison, broke formation suddenly, firing wildly into the mist. "Come on, you bastard," he screamed. "Get back in formation," Lyle shouted. Too late. Something massive and dark surged from the fog, enveloping Garrison. His scream cut off with a wet, crunching sound. The shape retreated as quickly as it had appeared, dragging Garrison with it. "Stay together," Reed ordered, as the rest of us instinctively moved to pursue. "That's what it wants." We tightened our circle, pressed together, weapons ready. I felt the pendant growing hotter against my skin, almost burning now. Something was building in the air around us, an electrical tension, a distortion of reality itself. "What's happening?" Lyle asked, voice tight with fear. Reed's expression was grim. "The door's opening." The fog began to rotate around us, forming a perfect circle with our group at the center. Through the swirling mist, impossible shapes moved, things I can't describe because my mind couldn't properly process what my eyes were seeing. Dimensions folded in ways they shouldn't. Spaces existed where no space should be. And in the center of it all, taking form from the mist itself, was the creature. It stood at least 9 feet tall, its body a nightmare amalgamation of features that seemed to shift and flow. One moment it appeared almost bear-like, the next more canine, then almost human, yet always wrong in fundamental ways. Its limbs bent at impossible angles. Its face, if you could call it that, contained too many eyes, too many mouths. Its skin rippled with patterns that hurt to look at directly. We fired. Every man emptied his weapon into the monstrosity. It recoiled, howling in pain and rage, black ichor spraying from wounds that closed almost as quickly as they formed. The pendant against my chest suddenly shattered, the fragments burning like hot coals. In that moment I understood, not through thought, but through some deeper insight that bypassed my conscious mind. "The symbols," I shouted. "Reverse the symbols." Reed understood immediately. While the others continued firing, keeping the creature at bay, Reed and I scrambled to rearrange the stones and sticks we had scattered. We placed them in reverse patterns, guided by some instinct I couldn't explain. The effect was immediate. The swirling fog faltered. The creature's form became less stable, parts of it seeming to flicker in and out of existence. It roared in fury and lunged toward us with renewed desperation. Lyle emptied his final rounds into its face, driving it back momentarily. "Whatever you're doing, do it faster." Reed and I completed the reversed pattern just as the creature gathered itself for another attack. The pendant fragments, still burning against my skin, suddenly disintegrated completely. The world seemed to hold its breath for one eternal moment. Then reality tore. A rift opened in the air itself, not darkness, but an absence more fundamental, a void that shouldn't exist in our universe. The creature howled as it was drawn toward the opening, its form stretching and distorting even further. It fought against the pull, digging clawed appendages into the earth, reaching for us with limbs that extended impossibly. One of the hunters was caught by a flailing tentacle and dragged screaming toward the rift. Lyle grabbed the man's arm and I grabbed Lyle's, forming a human chain. For a moment, we were locked in a tug of war with the creature, the hunter suspended between worlds. Then the hunter's arm simply came apart in Lyle's grip. He vanished into the void along with the creature. The rift collapsed with a sound like thunder, leaving behind nothing but a scorched circle in the clearing and the echoing silence of the forest. We stood frozen, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The fog was thinning rapidly now, sunlight beginning to penetrate between the trees. "Is it gone?" someone finally asked. Reed examined the ground where the rift had opened. "Not gone. Vanished. For now." "What the hell was that thing?" Lyle demanded. Reed shook his head. "Something that doesn't belong in our world. Something that found a way in and has been trying to establish itself here." "And the symbols? The rituals?" I asked. "Its way of reshaping our reality to make it more hospitable. Creating a bridge between worlds." We gathered what remained of our courage and equipment and made our way out of Deadfall Basin. As we climbed back to the main trail, our radios suddenly crackled back to life. "Anyone copy? This is Sheriff Patterson. We found something at the creek site, some kind of doorway." Reed grabbed his radio. "Sheriff, do not approach any structures. We encountered the entity. It's using these sites to create passages between worlds." Static then. "Reed, thank God. What happened?" "We'll explain when we meet up. But for now, destroy any symbolic arrangements you find. Completely dismantle them." "Understood. Return to the command post immediately." When we reached the trailhead, we found chaos. While we'd been in Deadfall Basin, the creature, or perhaps others like it, had attacked a search team on the eastern ridge. 5 men dead, 7 wounded. One of Dr. Weiss's colleagues was among the casualties. Sheriff Patterson looked haunted when we briefed him on what had happened. Dr. Weiss listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on the symbols we'd seen and the effects of reversing them. "You've confirmed much of what we suspected," she said when we finished. These entities exist in a space between dimensions. They create these ritual sites as anchor points to strengthen their presence in our reality. So, is it gone? Sheriff Patterson asked. Reed and Dr. Weiss exchanged glances. Not permanently, she said. You've closed the door for now, but it will try to find another way through. What do we do? I asked. Find and destroy every ritual site in these woods, Dr. Weiss said. Then seal the area. No human activity for at least a year. No logging, no hiking, nothing. Let the natural barriers between worlds strengthen again. The next 3 days were a blur of carefully coordinated expeditions into the forest. Teams of heavily armed men, each accompanied by one of Dr. Weiss's remaining colleagues, systematically located and dismantled every ritual site they could find. 17 in total, scattered throughout the mountains in a pattern that, when mapped, formed a massive symbol visible only from above. There were more encounters, glimpses of shapes moving through trees, strange sounds in the darkness, the occasional howl from distant ridges, but nothing like what we'd faced in Deadfall Basin. The entity was weakened, retreating. On the 4th day, as we prepared to dismantle the final known site, a massive storm rolled in. Not a natural storm. The clouds moved wrong, twisting and churning with purposeful malevolence. Lightning struck repeatedly around the ritual site as if trying to protect it. Sheriff Patterson made the call to proceed despite the danger. As the team approached the site, a complex arrangement of stones and bones on a high ridge, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees with a voice that sounded almost human. Lightning struck closer, igniting several trees. Through driving rain and howling wind, the team reached the site and began dismantling it. As the last stones were scattered, a final bolt of lightning struck the center of the circle. But instead of destroying it, the lightning seemed to be absorbed, channeled downward into the earth itself. The ground shuddered. A fissure opened, widening rapidly as the team scrambled to escape. Trees toppled into the growing chasm. Within minutes, what had been a small clearing was a gaping wound in the mountain, 30 feet across and of unknowable depth. As suddenly as it had begun, the storm dissipated. The fissure stopped expanding, though occasional rumbles suggested instability deep below. Forest Service geologists were called in to examine the phenomenon. Their instruments detected nothing unusual, just a sinkhole, they said, probably caused by underground streams weakening the limestone substrate. Those of us who knew better said nothing. Sometimes explanations are more comfortable than truth. In the aftermath, official reports cited a combination of bear attacks, geographic disorientation, and possible exposure to environmental toxins to explain the deaths and disappearances. The missing were eventually declared dead, their bodies presumably lost in the vast wilderness or destroyed by wildlife. Sheriff Patterson enforced Dr. Weiss's recommendation. With the support of state authorities, the eastern portion of the national forest was declared off-limits due to geological instability and environmental concerns. Logging operations were suspended indefinitely. Dr. Weiss and her remaining colleague left after a week, providing contact information should anything else occur. They took with them detailed documentation of everything we had seen and done. Life in Fallbrook attempted to return to normal. People spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy, creating narratives they could live with. The truth was too monstrous, too impossible to incorporate into daily life. But those of us who had encountered the entity firsthand knew better. We carried the knowledge like a physical weight. Some, like Reed, left town entirely. Others turned to alcohol or prescription medications to dull the memories. I stayed for a while trying to rebuild my life, but the nightmares continued, and sometimes on particularly still nights, I would hear distant howls from the mountains. Howls that couldn't possibly be wolves or coyotes. 2 months after the events at Deadfall Basin, I made my decision. I sold my tools, packed my few possessions, and left Fallbrook behind. I drove east, putting as much distance as possible between myself and those mountains. It's been 27 years since I left Fallbrook. I settled in Michigan, about as far from the Pacific Northwest as I could get, while staying in the continental United States. I found work as a mechanic here too. Some skills transfer anywhere, and eventually opened my own shop. I married, had a daughter, divorced. Life moved on. But the memories remained. For years I looked over my shoulder, expecting to see something emerging from shadows. I avoided forests entirely for a decade. The nightmares came less frequently, but never disappeared completely. I've told no one the full truth until now. Not my ex-wife, not my therapist, not the handful of friends I've made here. Who would believe it? Who would want to believe it? I stayed in sporadic contact with Lyle for a few years. He remained in Fallbrook longer than I did, eventually taking over management of the sawmill when operations resumed, in carefully selected areas well away from the eastern mountains. He married Marla, which surprised me but made a certain kind of sense. Shared trauma creates powerful bonds. Our conversations grew less frequent as years passed. The last time we spoke was 2011. He called late one night, voice tight with tension. "It's happening again," he said without preamble. My blood froze. "What do you mean?" "Hikers missing on the North Ridge. 3 in the last month. Sheriff found arrangements of stones and sticks." Sheriff Patterson had retired years earlier, replaced by a younger man who hadn't experienced the events of 1998. "Have you told them what it means?" I asked. "Tried to. They think I'm crazy. PTSD, they said." His laugh was bitter. "I called that Dr. Weiss. Numbers disconnected. Her colleague, too." "What are you going to do?" A long pause. "What we have to." "Lyle, don't. Call in the state authorities, FBI. Someone." "With what evidence?" "They sealed those records, Ewan. You know that. Official report says animal attacks and geological events." Another pause. "I just wanted you to know, in case..." "In case what?" "In case I don't call again." I tried to talk him out of whatever he was planning. Offered to come back, to help. He refused, said he had a group of locals who remembered, who would help him. That was the last time we spoke. I called repeatedly over the next few weeks, but he never answered. Eventually, his number was disconnected. I searched online news archives for any information. A small article in the regional paper mentioned tragic accident claims lives of local mill manager and 4 others in forest fire. Names listed included Lyle Dunnigan and Marla Simmons Dunnigan. I knew it wasn't a forest fire, at least not an accidental one. For years after, I monitored news from the Fallbrook area obsessively. Reports of missing hikers dropped to 0. Whatever Lyle and his group had done, it seemed to have worked, at least temporarily, until last month. I still have automated news alerts set for certain keywords associated with Fallbrook. On March 15, 2025, multiple alerts triggered simultaneously. Unprecedented seismic activity. Unexplained disappearances. Wildlife behaving abnormally. According to the reports, a minor earthquake had opened a fissure in the eastern mountains, precisely where our final team had dismantled the last ritual site. Forest Service personnel investigating the disturbance failed to return. A search party found their vehicles abandoned, equipment scattered. The article included a quote from the current sheriff. "We're dealing with a dangerous situation that may be connected to similar incidents in 1998 and 2011. We've requested federal assistance and are evacuating communities within a 10-mile radius of the affected area." They remembered, or at least some did. But would they know what to do? Would they understand what they were facing? I packed a bag that night, loaded my grandfather's old revolver. Not that it would do much good against what awaited in those mountains, but it was better than nothing. I wrote a letter to my daughter explaining where I was going and why, to be delivered if I didn't return. Then my phone rang. Unknown number. "Mr. Thibodeau?" A woman's voice, unfamiliar. "Yes? Who is this?" "My name is Sophia Weiss. You knew my mother, Eleanor." My heart skipped. "Dr. Weiss? How did you find me?" "Mother kept detailed records. Your name features prominently in her Fallbrook file." A pause. "She passed away 3 years ago, but she left protocols in place for certain scenarios. Fallbrook is one of them." "It's happening again, isn't it?" Yes, a team is assembling. People who have encountered these entities before, people with relevant expertise. We need your first-hand experience. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. The creature's shifting form, the wrongness of its existence, the deaths of people I knew. When and where? I asked. Portland International Airport, tomorrow, 3 p.m. A private plane will take us to a facility near Fallbrook. She hesitated. I should warn you, this incursion appears more significant than previous ones. The entity is stronger now, more established. How do you know? We've been monitoring certain indicators, unusual weather patterns, wildlife migrations, electromagnetic anomalies. All point to a major breach in the dimensional barriers. I thought of Lyle, of the sacrifice he and others had made in 2011. Would I be asked to make the same choice? I'll be there, I said finally. Thank you, Mr. Thibodeau. One more thing. Yes? Have you been experiencing dreams, particularly vivid ones involving the entity or the forests around Fallbrook? My throat tightened. The nightmares had returned in recent weeks, more intense than ever. How did you know? It's how they find anchors in our world, through minds that have encountered them before. You've been marked, Mr. Thibodeau. We all have. After we hung up, I stood at my window for a long time, staring at the night sky. Somewhere across the country, in mountains I had fled decades ago, something ancient and terrible was awakening again. Something that had touched my life, marked me in ways I was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow I would return to Fallbrook, to the forests that haunted my nightmares. I would face again what shouldn't exist in our world but did. I didn't know if I would survive this time, but I knew I had to try. For Lyle, for Walsh, for all those who had been taken by the entity, and for those who would be, if we failed. The pendant Dr. Weiss had given me all those years ago had disintegrated during our confrontation with the creature. But sometimes, in the darkness just before dawn, I can still feel its warmth against my skin. A reminder that boundaries exist between worlds and that some can be strengthened while others can be broken. I don't know what awaits me in Fallbrook, but I know this. Some horrors cannot be escaped, only confronted. Some doors, once opened, must be sealed by those who first glimpsed what lay beyond. My name is Ewan Thibodeau, and I am returning to the woods beyond Fallbrook, to finish what began in 1998, to close the door once and for all.